Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Let's begin with story 1, the Shell Kings of Cahokia. If you had stood on the eastern banks of the Mississippi River around the year 1100 CE, not far from where modern-day St. Louis now sprawls, you would have seen something astonishing. Rising from the fertile floodplain were towering earthen pyramids, massive, flat-topped mounds aligned with celestial rhythms. The largest among them, now called Monk's Mound, soared over 100 feet into the sky and covered more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Surrounding it was a city teeming with life, perhaps housing as many as 15,000 to 20,000 people at its peak. Welcome to Cahokia, the largest and most complex pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. Cahokia's rise is one of the most puzzling and quietly monumental chapters in North American history. No written records exist from its builders, and archaeologists have had to piece together its story from soil, debris, bones, and artifacts. What emerges from the dirt, however, is clear. This was no village of equals. Cahokia was a center of authority, and somewhere within it, most likely atop the grand mounds, lived people we might be tempted to call kings. But what did kingship look like here? The monumentality of power. To understand the magnitude of Cahokia's authority, you must first look at its architecture. Over 100 mounds were built in and around the city. Some were burial mounds, others served as ceremonial or elite residential platforms. Building them required immense labor, coordination, and food surpluses to sustain the workforce. This wasn't the result of casual cooperation. Someone had to organize, motivate, and control. The sheer scale suggests centralized leadership, but not necessarily inherited monarchy as Europeans would understand it. Cahokia's elites likely drew their power from a mix of religious authority, military control, and access to trade. Like other Mississippian cultures, the Cahokians used symbols of status, most famously engraved marine shell gorgets, copper plaques, and imported exotic stones to distinguish rulers from commoners. These objects weren't just decorative. They were sacred, tokens of cosmic order. The Great Plaza and Ritual Theater. Adjacent to Monk's Mound, a massive open plaza served as the heart of Cahokian public life. Archaeological digs have uncovered remains of wooden palisades, causeways, and perhaps even tall posts aligned to mark solstices. Scholars have long speculated that this plaza was not merely a marketplace or community space, it was a ritual theater where power was made visible. Imagine a crowd gathered in the plaza, the sun rising over Monk's Mound, where a priest chief emerged in feathered regalia. The rituals performed here were likely intended to reaffirm the cosmic role of leadership, keeping balance between the heavens, the earth, and the society. Political power wasn't separate from religion, it was embedded in it. That doesn't mean the system was benevolent. There is evidence of elite burials accompanied by human sacrifices. In one infamous burial pit at the site known as Mound 72, a male individual was laid to rest atop a bed of 20,000 shell beads, arranged in the shape of a falcon. Around him were over 250 other individuals, many apparently sacrificed. This is not equality, it is hierarchy made literal, and death rendered sacred. What fueled the rise? No great city arises without resources, and Cahokia was no exception. Located near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, it was ideally positioned for trade. Goods flowed in copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians. These materials weren't just commodities, they were imbued with spiritual power. The elites who controlled access to them became gatekeepers to the sacred. Cahokia also sat in an agriculturally rich zone, allowing for large-scale maize cultivation. This, more than any single innovation, likely enabled its urban rise. The food surpluses allowed a class of religious or political specialists to emerge, and with them, a new form of society, one where lineage and divine favor dictated status. It's important to remember that this was a distinctly American form of kingship. It had no palaces of stone, no written chronicles, no dynastic portraits. Power here was inscribed in soil, corn, and the slow rhythms of mound building. But make no mistake, power it was. A city of contrasts. Despite its grandeur, Cahokia was also deeply human in its contradictions. The city grew rapidly between 1050 and 1200, then mysteriously declined. For all the evidence of centralized authority, there's also evidence of conflict and instability. Burn layers in some palisades suggest attacks or internal unrest. Some scholars believe Cahokia may have suffered from ecological overreach, its deforestation, waste, and dependence on maize, possibly leading to collapse. This raises a question that continues to puzzle historians and archaeologists alike. How did such a powerful and complex society rise so quickly and fall just as suddenly? Was Cahokia truly ruled by kings, or by something more ephemeral, priests, councils, or a cult of ancestors? And perhaps more importantly, why do we not remember them? In most of the ancient world, the existence of kings and centralized power is tracked through inscriptions, monuments, and written records, chronicles that boast of conquests or divine favor. But in Cahokia, there is no writing, no engraved names of rulers, no dated battles, no written codices outlining taxes or decrees. And yet the mounds still rise, the artifacts still speak. In this section, we ask, how do we understand power when the people who held it left no written record? Symbolic authority, the role of sacred objects. Cahokia's elites wielded power through symbols and not merely decorative ones. These items formed a language of prestige and sacredness, known as iconography. The Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, SCCC, as modern archaeologists call it, was a shared religious and artistic tradition that stretched across much of what is now the southeastern United States. Cahokia was likely a spiritual and cultural center of this network. Copper plates engraved with dancing birdmen, stone axes polished to a mirror sheen, and marine shell gorgets carved with solar motifs. These weren't just fashion. They were statements. Only certain people could possess them, and in many cases they were buried with the dead, never to be touched again. These materials came from far away. Shells from the Gulf, obsidian from the Rockies, copper from the Great Lakes, all hinting at a vast trade network, one controlled by Cahokia's elites. Imagine what it meant to a villager when a chief unwrapped a glowing copper plaque at a ritual gathering. In a world where metals didn't come from stores but from rivers and mines hundreds of miles away, the person who held such an object wasn't just powerful, they were otherworldly. It is likely that much of Cahokia's authority came from this perceived connection to the divine or cosmic realm. Leaders may have claimed to speak for the ancestors, for the spirits of the land or sky. Their symbols, falcons, suns, and serpents, weren't just religious. They were political, binding people together in a sacred social order. The mystery of Mound 72, death and rank. If you want to see hierarchy without words, you go to the graves. Mound 72 has become one of the most studied and disturbing sites at Cahokia. It was built over several decades and contains multiple burials. At its center lies a male figure, assumed by some to be a ruler, though we can't name him. He was laid atop a litter covered with over 20,000 shell beads arranged in a falcon shape, a symbol associated with warrior elites. Around him were finely crafted artifacts, copper-covered rods, engraved arrowheads, and ceremonial items of clear prestige. But the most shocking part of Mound 72 is what surrounds this central burial. Nearby were the remains of over 250 other individuals. Some were carefully laid out in rows, young women, likely strangled or suffocated, then buried together. Others were thrown into the pit haphazardly, their bones broken or disarticulated. These appear to have been sacrifices. This burial wasn't just a funerary act, it was a political statement. The power of the dead was affirmed through the sacrifice of others. The community, or at least its elites, believed such a loss of life was justified in honoring the falcon man. It's hard not to draw comparisons to ancient royal burials in Mesopotamia or Egypt, where servants and concubines were sometimes killed to accompany the dead king. And yet, this is not Babylon. This is Illinois. So what do we call the person buried with such ceremony and blood? Was he a king, a priest, a divinely ordained war leader? We may never know, but his presence haunts the record and forces us to rethink what authority looked like in North America before Columbus. City planning and cosmic order. Cahokia wasn't built randomly. Its mounds and plazas were arranged with intent. Archaeologists have discovered astronomical alignments in its layout. The placement of Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, and certain post holes suggest that the city was designed according to cosmological principles. One discovery, a series of wooden posts nicknamed Woodhen, appears to have functioned like a calendar, marking solstices and equinoxes. On certain days, the sun would rise directly in line with a post when viewed from the center of the circle. This would have been highly significant to an agricultural society reliant on seasonal cycles. Whoever designed Cahokia's layout wasn't just a builder, they were a cosmologist. And whoever performed rituals at the center of these alignments had the aura of one who could manage the relationship between the heavens and the earth. In that way, power in Cahokia wasn't merely material, it was temporal and cosmic. The leader wasn't just telling people when to plant corn. He was showing that the gods had entrusted him to order the universe. It's possible that these rituals were a way to maintain legitimacy in the absence of written laws. If the people believed the ruler controlled the seasons, or at least understood their rhythms, they might have been more willing to accept their social station, even sacrifice, in that sacred order. A ruler without a name. We call the man in Mound 72 the Falcon Warrior. Some call him the Birdman, but we do not know his name. We do not know if he inherited power or took it by force. We don't know if he was one of many or a singular founder. But the patterns suggest that Cahokia was ruled, at least for a time, by a central authority figure with control over labor, trade, and ideology. One scholar, Timothy Paucatat, argues that around 1050 CE, a Big Bang moment transformed Cahokia almost overnight. A new ideology swept the region, new building projects began, and mound construction exploded. This suggests a revolutionary moment, a single charismatic leader or cult movement that restructured society. It is not impossible that a kind of American king emerged, perhaps not in the European mold, but as a paramount chief who ruled by charisma, control of trade, ritual knowledge, and willingness to spill blood. This kind of leadership may not have lasted long. By 1250 CE, Cahokia was in decline. Droughts, resource exhaustion, and possibly political conflict destabilized the region. The mounds remained, but the people slowly disappeared. When the first European explorers came through the area in the 1600s, they saw only grass-covered hills. The people who lived nearby had no memory of who had built them. The rulers of Cahokia, if that's what they were left, no dynasty, no empire, no lasting name. Just silence, soil, and bones. The structure without words. The challenge of Cahokia is that it reminds us, writing is not the only way to structure power. Without laws, contracts, or decrees, a society can still organize itself into classes, build monuments, and carry out religious sacrifice. Power can exist in gesture, in architecture, in stories passed orally from one generation to another. The people of Cahokia believed in order. They believed in rank, in cosmic alignment, in sacred cycles. They buried their dead with care or sometimes with violence. But even as the mounds rose and the falcon warriors ruled, the world was changing. And so we ask, what caused the collapse? Was it climate? Was it internal conflict? Did the people turn on their sacred leaders when the corn failed and the rivers changed? Or was the entire project of Cahokia always temporary, a flash of the divine that, like all things, was meant to fade. By the mid-13th century, something began to unravel in Cahokia. The grand plazas no longer bustled with the same scale of ceremonial activity. The mounds stopped rising, households grew sparse, and signs of disrepair and abandonment crept into what had once been the most sophisticated city north of Mesoamerica. By around 1350 CE, the city was largely empty. No foreign army sacked Cahokia. No sweeping plague erased its population. There was no grand war, no decisive battle written into chronicles because there were no chronicles. But the silence that followed was just as complete. What we are left with in this final section is the slow unraveling of an American city that had once crowned its leaders with shells and sacrifice. What caused the collapse, and why was the memory of such a powerful place so thoroughly erased? Environmental strain and the limits of growth. To understand Cahokia's fall, we must first consider the ecology that had allowed it to rise. The American Bottom, the floodplain where Cahokia was located, is one of the most fertile stretches of land in North America, but it is also a fragile environment. Large-scale maize agriculture supported the city's explosive growth, but agriculture comes with costs. Clearing land for farming and mound building led to deforestation. The need for firewood, construction materials, and open land pushed the boundaries of the forest further back. Erosion followed. Without trees to hold the soil, rainstorms likely caused flooding and runoff. Agricultural yields may have declined. The city that had relied so heavily on maize more so than many of its predecessors became vulnerable to crop failure. Pollen samples from nearby lakebeds suggest periods of environmental stress during this time. Droughts in the 1200s could have further strained resources. When the food stopped flowing reliably, the social contract, unwritten though it was, began to fray. In a society where political and religious authority were tied directly to the ability to provide food and cosmic order, a failed harvest wasn't just an agricultural problem. It was a crisis of legitimacy. The walls go up. In Cahokia's final century, something changes in the landscape. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of multiple palisade walls constructed around the central precinct of the city. These weren't decorative fences. They were defensive works, walls of logs built in long trenches, sharpened at the top, sometimes rebuilt over earlier versions. Inside them were elite mounds and residences. This fortification suggests the city was no longer united. Perhaps internal factions began vying for control, or perhaps the surrounding communities, no longer benefiting from the ceremonial and economic center, began to challenge its authority. It is possible that what once held the city together shared ritual, sacred leadership. Redistribution of goods broke down into distrust and protectionism. The elite may have tried to hold on to power by retreating behind barriers, both physical and symbolic. But a society behind walls is rarely a stable one. The very need for defense implies a loss of consensus. The end of the ritual calendar. The rituals that once bound Cahokia together also seem to disappear. The massive feasting events that had once fed thousands leave fewer traces. The carefully constructed calendar alignments are no longer maintained. Wood hinge posts rot and are not replaced. The alignment between sun, mound, and ritual is forgotten. People no longer gather at the Grand Plaza in the same way. In societies where authority is legitimized through religion, the decline of ritual is often the final signal of collapse. The sacred kings or priest leaders lose their cosmic power when the people no longer gather to witness it. Without shared ceremony, identity fragments. Leadership becomes local again. Villages, clans, or households drift into independence. The spell of the city breaks. Where did the people go? Cahokia was not destroyed, it was abandoned. The people did not vanish, they moved. Archaeological evidence suggests that groups migrated outward from the city in all directions north into the Great Lakes, south along the Mississippi, west across the plains. Some joined existing cultures. Others formed new villages. The Mississippian way of life continued elsewhere, but never again with the same centrality or scale. This dispersal likely led to the emergence of new polities with roots in Cahokian traditions. For example, later mound-building societies like those at Etowah, Spiro, and Moundville share religious motifs and social structures that echo Cahokia's past. Shell gorgets and copper plates still appear, but in more fragmented contexts. Cahokia became not a capital, but a memory. The silence of the Europeans. By the time French explorers came to the region in the late 17th century, Cahokia was long gone. They encountered local native peoples Illiniwek, Tamaroa, and others living in smaller villages, farming and trading. When they asked about the great earthen mounds rising from the landscape, the answers were vague. The locals did not claim to have built them. They did not claim knowledge of the Falcon warriors or the Shell kings. The memory of Cahokia, once a sacred city, had been forgotten or perhaps deliberately left behind. This erasure is both haunting and telling. It is a reminder that history, especially unwritten history, is fragile. Civilizations can rise, thrive, collapse, and vanish, leaving behind only architecture and artifacts. Without writing, there is no official memory, only interpretation. The European colonists built settlements near the site but showed little interest in preserving its history. The mounds were sometimes dug up for treasure or flattened for farming. Monk's Mound earned its name not from ancient rulers, but from French Trappist monks who farmed nearby in the 1800s. Kings without names, power without stone. So what do we make of Cahokia's rulers? They likely wore feathers instead of crowns. Their palaces were made of wood, not stone. Their tombs were marked not by inscriptions, but by the sacrifice of others. They organized labor on a massive scale. They controlled trade routes stretching hundreds of miles. They ruled, it seems, through a blend of charisma, ritual, fear, and sacred legitimacy. They were kings perhaps, or priests, or chiefs. The lines blur. But they had power, and they exercised it over tens of thousands of people. In a time before cities in the American Midwest were imagined, they built one and governed it with a vision aligned to the stars. When the food ran low, when the rituals failed, and when the trust frayed, they lost that power, not in a blaze but in a long silence. The lessons of Cahokia. Why does Cahokia matter? Because it shows us that North America was not an empty wilderness before European contact. It was a continent of cities, of complexity, of governance. It reminds us that leadership takes many forms, that kingship need not be crowned in gold to be real. Cahokia also reminds us that power is fragile. It can be built without writing, sustained through ritual, and still fall without war. The people who made Cahokia had no steel, no wheels, no horses, but they had vision. They moved earth by hand and reshaped a landscape to reflect the order of the cosmos. And then they were gone. We still walk their ground, plant corn in their fields, and build highways near their mounds. But we cannot name their rulers. We do not know their laws. We see only the ghost of a city and the silent, grassy hills that remain. In the end, we must ask, if a society can rise and fall without leaving a single name behind, what does it mean to be remembered? Story 2. Pueblo Confederacy's governance without kings in the desert Southwest. If you were to step into the arid highlands of the American Southwest sometime around the year 1000 CE, you would find a landscape that seems inhospitable at first glance: dry mesas, cliffs, and canyons stretching to the horizon. And yet, hidden in these canyons were cities. Not cities of towering pyramids like Cahokia, but sprawling complexes of sandstone masonry. Thousands of rooms stacked into cliffsides, ceremonial kivas sunk into the ground, and evidence of roads stretching into the horizon. This was the world of the ancestral Pueblones, often historically referred to as the Anasazi, a name many modern Pueblo descendants consider outdated. What makes their story remarkable is not just their architecture or longevity, but how they governed. For in this region there were no kings, no palaces, no golden thrones or tombs of conquest. And yet, they built some of the most enduring communities in North American history. Chaco Canyon, a center without a crown. At the heart of this story lies Chaco Canyon, in present-day New Mexico. Between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, Chaco became the ceremonial and economic hub of a regional network stretching hundreds of miles. At its peak, it housed monumental structures known as great houses, such as Pueblo Bonito, with over 600 rooms and multiple stories. These were feats of engineering, built in a place where water was scarce and the growing season was short. Unlike the mound cities of the East, Chaco's great houses were constructed from shaped sandstone and timber beams hauled from over 50 miles away. They featured T-shaped doorways, massive plazas, and subterranean ceremonial chambers called kivas. Some kivas were great kivas, as large as 60 feet across, designed to hold dozens of people for community ceremonies. But even here, there is no evidence of monarchs, no single name passed down, no signs of palaces or exclusive elite quarters. Instead, what we see is collective architecture designed for gatherings, rituals, and social cohesion. So how did Chaco function without rulers? Power without personalities. Unlike Cahokia, Chaco's power seems to have been less centered on individuals and more on institutions. The society that built it likely relied on shared cosmology, ritual coordination, and consensus-based leadership among different clans and communities. The very layout of Chacan architecture speaks to its communal logic. Great houses were not homesteads for powerful lords, but spaces for gatherings, storage, feasts, and ceremony. Some archaeologists believe that certain lineages or religious societies may have coordinated Chaco's ceremonial calendar and trade routes, but without enforcing top-down rule. There were no royal tombs. While some burials in Chaco contain elaborate grave goods, turquoise beads, shell ornaments, these are few and far between. They suggest individuals of special status, perhaps religious leaders or respected elders, but not monarchs. More importantly, the most prestigious burial ever found in Chaco, two men buried with over 11,000 turquoise pieces, was within a room deep inside Pueblo Bonito, not in a separate monumental grave. And still, no names. If anything, Chaco represents a model of ritual political coordination rather than hierarchical domination. Roads to nowhere, or ritual highways. One of the most puzzling features of Chacan society is its road system. Hundreds of miles of straight roads radiate out from Chaco Canyon, some up to 30 feet wide, and cutting in nearly straight lines across mesas and canyons. They connect Chaco to outlier settlements across the region, including Aztec ruins, Salmon ruins, and Quinbainiola. But here's the twist. Many of these roads lead to places where no people lived. They end at isolated shrines or nothing at all. This suggests the roads weren't merely economic pathways, they were ritual landscapes, perhaps connecting sacred sites or pilgrimage routes. And yet again, the coordination of this massive infrastructure wasn't done by decree of a king. It was done by collective religious will. Through ceremonies, clan alliances, and sacred storytelling, the people of the region maintained a shared sense of identity and purpose across vast distances. This was networked governance without kings, without armies, and without bureaucracy. Kivas, clans, and consensus. The kiva was the center of Pueblo ceremonial life. These round, semi-subterranean structures were modeled after ancient pit houses, symbolizing a connection to the underworld and ancestral emergence. In many Pueblo traditions, the people are said to have emerged from a prior world through a sipapu, or spirit hole, often represented in the center of the kiva. Kivas weren't private. They were communal, sacred, and often clan-specific. Different kivas may have represented different kinship groups, each with their own rituals, responsibilities, and cosmological roles. From this emerged a kind of clan-based governance, where no one person ruled but many had responsibilities. Decisions were likely made through councils, rituals, and seasonal gatherings. Elders and religious leaders, sometimes referred to by modern scholars as caciques, though this term comes from the Taino language, held influence, but not in a centralized or coercive way. Even today, among the descendants of the ancestral Puebloans, modern Pueblo peoples such as the Hopi, Zuni, and Tewa leadership often remains rotational, ceremonial, and non-authoritarian. Authority resides in knowledge, not domination. This tradition may date all the way back to Chaco and even earlier. Power as sacred stewardship, not control. Among the Pueblo peoples, leadership is not seen as an opportunity for personal gain. Rather, it is a burden of stewardship. The leader, often a religious figure, must maintain harmony, both socially and cosmically. They ensure the proper timing of ceremonies, the respectful treatment of ancestors, and the moral behavior of the community. In this system, to lead is not to control, but to hold balance. Compare this with the hierarchy of Cahokia, where elite burials and mass sacrifice tell a story of domination. In Chaco, power appears more subtle, embedded in ritual cycles, mythology, and collective labor. There are no shell kings here. Instead, there are keepers of tradition, whose authority exists only so long as they act in service to the whole. And still, they built cities. They organized labor. They constructed solar alignments, stored surplus corn, and traded across hundreds of miles. They did everything we expect from a state, but without a sovereign. The Great Mystery. Chaco Canyon, like Cahokia, did not last forever. By the late 1100s, signs of stress emerged. Construction slowed. Droughts, resource scarcity, and overpopulation may have pushed the limits of sustainability. People began leaving. The great kivas went silent. The roads ceased to carry pilgrims. By 1300 CE, Chaco was largely abandoned. But the people didn't disappear. They moved south and east into the Rio Grande Valley to places like Acoma, Zuni, and Hopi. They carried their stories, their ceremonies, their kiva traditions. They remembered the sacred obligations that no king could claim as his own. Today, the Pueblo people still live in those lands, still holding councils, still planting corn, still passing on the stories of their emergence and responsibilities to the land. But Chaco became a whisper in stone, a reminder that the greatest societies are not always ruled from a throne. What kind of power endures longer, the authority of kings or the memory of sacred responsibility? We've seen how the ancestral Puebloans built complex societies without kings, thrones, or empires. But what does it mean to live in a society without centralized power? How do decisions get made when no one has the final say? And what happens when agreement so essential to consensus-based systems breaks down? To understand the endurance and fragility of the Pueblo confederacies, we need to look beyond the sandstone walls of Chaco and into the structures of social order. These communities, often misunderstood as simple or egalitarian, were anything but passive. Their systems were deeply layered, often ceremonial, always collective, and at times painfully slow. In this section, we enter the space between consensus and collapse. From Chaco to the Mesa, migration and adaptation. As the Chaco system unraveled around 1150 CE, people moved. Many migrated to Mesa Verde in modern-day southwestern Colorado, a region already inhabited, but now growing in population and importance. Here, the iconic cliff dwellings were built multi-story apartment-like homes nestled beneath sandstone overhangs. Spruce Tree House, Cliff Palace, and Balcony House still evoke awe today. These were not defensive fortresses in the traditional sense, but their placement hidden, elevated and difficult to access, suggests a growing need for security and cohesion. This was a time of environmental stress. Drought conditions strained water sources. Soils eroded. Conflicts may have grown between groups. The people responded not with kings but with tight-knit community designs. Families clustered together. Kivas remained central, sometimes shared between small groups. The architecture promoted interdependence. You couldn't isolate yourself in a cliff dwelling, you had to work with your neighbors. Ritual as governance. In the absence of rulers, ritual became law. Among the ancestral and modern Pueblo peoples, ceremonial cycles play a governing role. These are not festivals for leisure, they are time-keeping, rule-enforcing, moral-regulating systems. The Katsina, Kachina ceremonies of the Hopi and Zuni, for example, involve masked dancers who represent spirit beings. They instruct the people, bless the crops, and model ethical behavior. But these are not myths frozen in the past. Even in modern pueblos, religious societies rotate leadership and responsibilities. There is no lifetime chief. Instead, ritual office rotates, often annually, and each clan or society plays a specific role: planting, hunting, healing, war, or rain-bringing. These roles are sacred obligations, not career aspirations. To lead is to serve. To serve is to know the stories. This distributed structure traces back to the time of Chaco and beyond. Archaeological evidence from outlier sites like Yellow Jacket Pueblo and Aztec ruins shows consistency in Kiva architecture and ceremonial layout, even across hundreds of miles. This suggests coordinated ceremonial governance, passed orally and ritually, with no written laws or proclamations. The challenge of consensus. But consensus is not always peaceful. It is a slow and demanding form of governance. When a community makes decisions through councils or ritual societies, every voice matters, or at least every clan or household has a role. Disagreements must be resolved through negotiation, not command. This makes for resilient, inclusive systems, but also creates vulnerability during times of crisis. Imagine a multi-family village deciding whether to move fields, respond to a drought, or deal with a neighboring group's aggression. Without a sovereign to issue orders, the process can be paralyzing. When consensus fails, splintering often follows. This is exactly what seems to have happened in the late 1200s. Mesa Verde, for all its innovation, began to show signs of tension. Sites were abandoned rapidly around 1275–1300 CE. There is archaeological evidence of food shortages, and in some cases, violent deaths and burned dwellings. A society built on harmony began to crack under pressure. This was not due to authoritarian failure, but the cost of cooperation in a high-stress environment. The Great Migration. By the early 1300s, much of the Four Corners region was empty. People moved south and east, forming new villages along the Rio Grande and Little Colorado River. Some built pueblos with hundreds of rooms, but the structure was different now. There was more emphasis on modularity, smaller kivas per household group, multiple plazas, and distributed ritual leadership. This was not a collapse in the sense of disappearance. It was a reorganization, a redistribution of population and knowledge across a wider region. The descendants of these migrations still live in places like Acoma Pueblo, Zuni Pueblo, and the Hopi Mesas. These communities, continuously inhabited for 800+ years, are among the oldest in North America. Their governance remains remarkably stable and intentionally non-centralized. The role of memory in maintaining order. How does a society with no written records pass on its law, its ethics, and its responsibilities? The Pueblo answer is storytelling. Origin myths, migration narratives, clan lineages, and ceremonial duties are passed down through performance, ritual, and instruction. Young people are taught their responsibilities not through legislation, but through initiation into sacred knowledge. The past is not distant, it lives in the landscape, in the stories of emergence, and in the designs painted on pottery and kiva walls. Take, for instance, the Hopi migration story, which tells of how different clans traveled from distant places to their current homes. Each clan has its own path, but they converge with mutual recognition and shared ceremonial obligations. This myth explains not only the origin of the people, but also their political framework: multiple origins, shared responsibility, no singular authority. In this way, memory substitutes for monarchy, coexisting without rulers. The modern Pueblo peoples are not a single political body. There is no Pueblo nation in the way we think of nations today. Instead, they are a network of independent yet culturally connected villages, each with its own language, dialect, ceremonies, and leadership structures. Some are matrilineal, others patrilineal. Some rotate authority by clan, others by ceremonial office. And yet, they've maintained internal peace for centuries, even under the pressure of colonization, religious conversion, and U.S. government interference. This cohesion without centralization is the legacy of the ancient confederacies of the Southwest. It is what allowed these communities to survive drought, migration, and colonial violence, not through domination, but through adaptability. A question of recognition. Why don't we recognize the Pueblo systems as governments? Because they don't match the European model. There are no kings, no flags, no armies of conquest or legal codes written in marble, but there is structure, there is law, there is accountability. Western historians have often privileged centralized, hierarchical societies because they leave behind names, monuments, and battles. But governance does not require a crown. The Pueblo confederacies governed through ritual, council, and memory forms of power that do not always impress outside observers, but that sustain communities over centuries. In a way, this is the anti-Cahokia, a system designed not for expansion and spectacle, but for balance and continuity. And that balance is always under negotiation. When the rains don't come and the corn fails, who do you blame in a society with no kings? By the time European colonists arrived in the American Southwest, the Pueblo world had already changed dramatically. Chaco Canyon was silent. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde had been abandoned for centuries, but the people were still there, living in stone villages on mesas and plains, planting corn in dry earth, holding ceremonies in kivas, and governing themselves without kings. This final section explores the extraordinary resilience of Pueblo governance, a story not of conquest and dominion, but of survival through structure. Against drought, against Spanish colonization, and against the pressures of modern assimilation, the Pueblo peoples endured, not because of monarchs or standing armies, but because of distributed, sacred, collective governance. In a world that often defines power by how loudly it commands, the Pueblos offer a different model, one where strength lies in quiet continuity. The Spanish encounter, misunderstanding power. When Spanish conquistadors and missionaries arrived in Pueblo lands in the 16th century, they didn't understand what they saw. Expecting kings or chiefs, clear sovereigns who could negotiate, surrender, or convert entire communities, the Spaniards instead found council-led villages, rotating religious offices, and a deep resistance to centralized control. The Pueblos were polite but firm. Decisions took time. Authority wasn't absolute. To the colonizers, this looked like weakness. In reality, it was the opposite. The Pueblos' distributed leadership structures made them resilient to outside interference. With no single leader to coerce and no throne to capture, Spanish efforts at domination were repeatedly frustrated. And when the repression became too great, the Pueblos organized a response together. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680, a confederacy strikes back. One of the most remarkable moments in North American history, though still too often overlooked, is the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. For decades, Spanish colonial authorities had imposed forced labor, Christian conversion, and violent punishment on Pueblo communities. Sacred sites were destroyed. Ceremonial dances were banned. Priests and soldiers tried to dismantle the fabric of Pueblo life, believing that without central rulers, resistance would be impossible. They were wrong. In a stunning act of coordination, multiple Pueblo communities came together across vast distances to plan a simultaneous uprising. The leader most associated with the revolt was Pape, a Tewa man from Oke-Owenje. But even he was not a king, he was a spiritual leader and messenger, trusted for his vision. Using runners and knots in cords to signal timing, the Pueblos struck on August 10, 1680. Churches were burned. Missionaries were killed or expelled. Spanish settlers fled. Within days, the colonists had been driven from nearly all Pueblo lands. For 12 years, the Pueblos regained their autonomy. It was the most successful indigenous uprising against European colonization in what would become the United States. And it was done without a centralized government. Instead, it was the strength of inter-village ties, shared memory, spiritual unity, and consensus that made it possible. Decentralization as strength. The revolt revealed what Pueblo governance could achieve when pushed to the edge, but it also revealed the limits of unity. After the Spanish returned in 1692, they did so with more diplomacy and less violence. Some Pueblos made accommodations, others resisted. Without a single leader to dictate policy, the Pueblo response was diverse, and that diversity was survival. No single defeat could crush them. No one treaty could bind them all. The same structure that puzzled colonizers became a shield. Even today, each Pueblo operates as a sovereign entity, with its own government, ceremonial calendar, and social structure. Acoma, Zuni, Taos, Santa Clara, Hopi each is unique. And yet, they remain connected by shared principles passed down since the time of Chaco and earlier. Governance is rotational, not permanent. Authority is earned, not inherited. Leaders are ritual stewards, not political tyrants. Decisions require consensus, not coercion. It is a model that frustrates colonial categories and persists anyway. Modern Pueblo governance, continuity amid pressure. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the Pueblo peoples faced continued pressure from the U.S. government to assimilate. Boarding schools, land theft, religious suppression, and imposed political systems all aimed to dismantle traditional governance. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act made all Native Americans U.S. citizens, a move many Pueblos viewed with suspicion. With citizenship came new forms of government often modeled on European American systems of mayors and councils. Some Pueblos adapted, creating dual systems, maintaining traditional religious civic roles alongside elected tribal governments. Others rejected imposed models entirely. In every case, the heart of Pueblo governance remained rooted in the principles of ritual responsibility, collective leadership, and respect for tradition. Even today, many Pueblos rotate ceremonial leadership annually. Offices are held for short terms, and leaders are expected to return to ordinary life afterward. No one rules. Everyone contributes. This is not nostalgia, it is functioning governance. It feeds the people, protects the land, and carries forward the stories. Architecture as memory. Walk through a modern Pueblo, and you'll still see multi-story adobe buildings, plazas, kivas, and ceremonial chambers echoing Chaco and Mesa Verde. These are not monuments to the past, they are living spaces, shaped by memory. Kivas are still entered through the roof. Corn is still planted with prayer. Ceremonies are held in accordance with celestial events. The architecture is not just functional, it is ideological. It reminds everyone of their place in the community, their duties, and their ancestors. The space itself enforces harmony. Where other societies built palaces and stone idols, the pueblos built spaces for gathering, and those spaces endure. What was lost in what was? The world has changed. Colonization has taken its toll. Languages have been lost. Some ceremonies were interrupted. Resources are still threatened, and sovereignty is often contested. But the Pueblo Confederacy remain one of the longest continuing systems of governance on the continent. Their story is not one of golden crowns or military conquests. It is a story of balance over ambition, continuity over consolidation, survival through structure. They remind us that greatness doesn't require domination, that a society can last 1,000 years without a king, and that sometimes the quietest forms of power endure the longest. In the end, we must ask, what does it mean to be powerful if your people still thrive long after your cities are dust? Story 3. The Lost Lords of Etowah Mounds, Rulers and Sacred Order. If you had stood on the banks of the Etowah River in northern Georgia around 1300 CE, you would have seen a place of quiet dominance. Unlike Cahokia, with its vast urban sprawl, or Chaco Canyon, with its ceremonial symmetry, the Etowah site seems almost understated. 7 earthen mounds, rising gently from the floodplain, surrounded by palisades and wooden dwellings. But beneath this simple landscape lay a system of social hierarchy, spiritual order, and ritual governance that spoke volumes. This was a regional capital of the Mississippian culture, a civilization that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. Etowah may not be a household name, but for 2 centuries, it stood as a sacred center of power, trade, and elite rule. And unlike the consensus-based world of the Pueblos, Etowah had lords, or at least something very close. The Etowah site, more than mounds. Located in what is today Bartow County, Georgia, the Etowah Indian Mounds preserve a site that was once home to several thousand people. Its largest mound, Mound A, stands over 60 feet tall and commands the landscape. A grand plaza stretches before it, and smaller mounds surround it on multiple sides. The layout is not accidental. Like Cahokia, the Etowah site reflects cosmological alignment, the sacred balance between the earth, the sky, the ancestors, and the living. The mounds themselves were platforms, not tombs. On their summits stood elite residences, temples, or council houses, places where decisions were made, ceremonies held, and power enacted. Below the mounds lived the commoners, farmers, artisans, laborers whose thatched homes formed the body of the community. Around the entire complex rose a wooden palisade, likely built and rebuilt multiple times, signaling both defensive concern and symbolic boundary. This wasn't just a village. It was a sacred capital where religious, political, and social roles converged. The rise of Etowah, a regional power. Etowah's rise around 1000 CE was part of the broader expansion of the Mississippian world, a cultural complex centered on mound building, maize agriculture, and ranked societies. Cahokia may have been the first great city of this culture, but as it declined in the 13th century, new centers rose to fill the void. Etowah was one of them. It likely controlled the surrounding region for miles, commanding tribute, organizing feasts, and redistributing goods. The Etowah River connected it to the Coosa and Alabama rivers, forming a watery network of trade and communication. Canoes carried shells from the Gulf, copper from the Appalachians, and mica from the Carolina Piedmont. These materials were transformed into symbols of elite power, engraved gorgets, copper plates, and stone effigies. Such goods were not common. They were restricted, controlled by the ruling class, and infused with sacred meaning. Power in Etowah, as in Cahokia, was deeply visual and material. You could see it in the body of the lord, in the gleam of copper, in the height of the mound. Burials of the elite, evidence of hierarchy. The most telling signs of Etowah's social structure come from its burials. In the 1920s, archaeologist Warren Moorhead excavated several mound tombs at the site. What he found was striking. Elite individuals laid to rest with hundreds of shell beads, ceremonial axes, elaborate headdresses, and stone statues carved in human form. Some burials appear to represent paired figures, a male and female, each richly adorned, perhaps signaling a form of dual rulership or sacred marriage. The statues that once accompanied them are some of the most remarkable pre-Columbian carvings in North America. Serene, seated figures with detailed jewelry, clothing, and facial features. These are not generalized icons. They are portraits of the elite, perhaps rulers, or ancestors, or even deities. In any case, they tell us that identity mattered at Etowah. Social rank was not a vague suggestion, it was a structured order, reinforced in life and death. Unlike Chaco or the Pueblos, where leadership rotated or remained hidden in ritual societies, Etowah's power was visible. It was buried in the ground, worn on the body, and displayed atop the mounds. Symbols of power, the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. Etowah was deeply embedded in what scholars call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, SECC, a symbolic system shared across the Mississippian world. This was a language of icons, used to express warrior ideals, cosmic order, and elite legitimacy. Etowah's artifacts feature motifs such as the hand and eye, representing the portal between worlds; birdmen or falcon dancers, symbols of elite warriors and solar power; crosses and sunbursts, cosmic order and sacred timing; weeping eye gorgets, indicating ritual knowledge or perhaps grief. These weren't just decorative. They were part of a shared spiritual grammar, and the rulers of Etowah wielded this grammar to connect themselves with the divine. By controlling access to SECC symbols, the elite controlled not only trade but meaning. They determined what was sacred and who could speak for the gods. That is not merely governance, it is ritual sovereignty. Were they kings? And yet, we hesitate to call them kings. No written records name an Etowah ruler. No inscriptions proclaim their conquests. Their power was sacred, yes, but was it centralized? Was it dynastic? Did they rule over subjects or lead ritual consensus? Here we enter ambiguity. Some archaeologists suggest Etowah's leadership resembled a paramount chiefdom, a central authority coordinating regional villages, collecting tribute, and presiding over ceremonial life. Others argue it was more fluid, with sacred lineage groups rotating leadership or sharing ritual duties. The truth may lie between. Etowah's elite lived differently, dressed differently, and died differently from the rest. They were not equal, but whether they commanded armies or simply held ritual supremacy is unclear. They may have ruled by mystique, not mandate. Their power was symbolic, cosmological, expressed in copper, shells, and serpentine pathways, not laws or taxes. They were not kings in the European sense. But to the people of Etowah, they may have been the center of the world. The question that remains: Etowah flourished for nearly 300 years, and then, sometime in the 14th century, it declined. Its mounds remained, but the center faded. Political focus shifted to other Mississippian sites: Ocmulgee, Moundville, Coosa. The great statues were buried. The elites vanished from history. What caused the fall? Environmental change, warfare, political realignment. The Mississippian world was always in motion. Its centers rose and fell like tides, each one echoing a sacred order, briefly made visible in earth and fire. And yet we still wonder, what became of the rulers buried with so many shells and statues? Did they lose power, or were they simply forgotten? At a glance, Etowah might seem like a quiet place: mounds, fields, a river curling through the countryside. But beneath that calm was a deeply structured world, one where religion, power, and daily survival were woven tightly together. In this section, we dive deeper into the ritualized structure of life at Etowah, the systems that maintained elite authority, and how power was enacted not just through rule but through performance. This was a society where governance wasn't just spoken, it was staged. The plaza, stage for ritual and authority. The plaza that stretched before the great mounds of Etowah was not an empty field. It was the public theater of legitimacy. Here, the rituals that upheld the elite's status were performed for all to see: dances, feasts, solar alignments, and seasonal ceremonies that reaffirmed the sacred place of rulers in the cosmos. In Mississippian societies like Etowah, ritual was not a sideshow to politics, it was politics. Public ceremonies served multiple functions. They reinforced hierarchy, separating those who danced, fasted, or led from those who simply watched. They displayed wealth in the form of costumes, feasts, and offerings. They managed time, marking the seasons for planting, harvest, and trade. They legitimized leadership, not with documents or edicts, but through collective awe. Imagine the central mound glowing in the morning sun. A figure in a copper breastplate steps forward. Drums sound. Feathered dancers move in concentric patterns, their steps echoing cosmological beliefs passed down generations. Smoke rises from incense or burning herbs. All around, people watch in silence. No speech is needed. Everyone already knows what it means. This is power performed. The role of religion in political legitimacy. Etowah's ruling class was not merely secular. Their legitimacy was tied to their spiritual knowledge, their connection to celestial cycles, and their role as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds. Artifacts and mound alignments show careful astronomical planning. Some align with solar solstices. Others may have marked lunar standstills or equinoxes. The ruler's home, placed atop the tallest mound, was quite literally closer to the sky, a symbolic and physical elevation above common space. This connection to the heavens wasn't decorative. It was cosmic evidence of rightful rule. And for the elite, such status required maintenance. Failing to properly perform rituals to mark the turning of the seasons or to organize communal feasts wasn't just a political failure. It was a sign of cosmic disorder. Drought, famine, or war could be interpreted as evidence that the lords had lost divine favor. That made ritual not optional but central to governance. Labor, tribute, and control. Etowah's lords did not rule alone, and their power was not just symbolic. Large-scale construction projects such as the building of mound required years of coordinated labor. Dirt was hauled basket by basket, often from great distances. Wooden palisades were rebuilt regularly. Fields were cleared and planted communally. All of this demanded social coordination and surplus. But how was labor organized in a society without writing? Most scholars agree that Mississippian leaders, including those at Etowah, oversaw a system of tribute and labor taxation. Surrounding communities likely provided goods, corn, fish, shell beads, and seasonal labor to the central site. In return, they may have received access to feasts, ceremonies, and ritual protection. In this way, Etowah functioned like a ritual capital, absorbing tribute and redistributing sacred services. The elite controlled redistribution, not through commerce, but through ceremony. And the cost of resistance, likely exclusion from rituals, feasts, or protection, a punishment that could be both social and spiritual. Warrior ideals and sacred violence. Etowah was not a city of pure peace. The palisades that ringed the site, tall wooden walls with bastions and ditches, signal concern about external threats. Some mounds have evidence of burn layers, suggesting that conflict did occur, either internally or with rival chiefdoms. Mississippian iconography glorified warrior elites. Shell gorgets from Etowah depict birdman figures with weapons raised, their posture active, commanding. These were not depictions of gods alone, they were aspirational archetypes for elite men. War, ritual, and leadership were intertwined. The elite may have led raids, organized defense, and conducted ritual warfare that reaffirmed their role as protectors of the cosmos. And in some cases, ritual included sacrifice. While Etowah lacks the mass burials seen at Cahokia, some graves show signs of secondary burials or possible retainer sacrifices. These acts were not done randomly. They were staged, meaningful, and in a grim way spiritual. Violence, when used, was part of the cosmic contract. The disappearance of the lords. Etowah's height came between 1,250–1,375 CE. Then, like Cahokia before it, the site was abandoned. Mounds were no longer used. Ceremonies ceased. The plaza fell silent. Why? Several theories compete. Climate change. A series of droughts may have reduced maize yields, undermining the food base of elite control. Internal rebellion. Resentment against tribute or sacred power could have led to a withdrawal of support. Shifting trade. Regional trade networks may have realigned toward other centers like Coosa or Moundville. Political fragmentation. The loss of cosmic legitimacy could have splintered the ruling lineage. In truth, it was likely all of these. When ceremony failed to deliver rain or unity, when food ran low and ritual could no longer explain the suffering, people simply left. Without their audience, the lords had no stage. Echoes of authority, descendants and the people of Etowah didn't disappear. Their descendants continued to live in the southeast, forming part of the cultures that would later be called Muskogee, Creek, Yuchi, and Cherokee. These later societies remembered the mounds, the riverways, and perhaps even the shell-bedecked dead. Oral traditions speak of ancient cities and sacred leaders, of times when people lived in earth lodges and danced in grand plazas. Though names faded, the structure of ritual society persisted, often blending with new beliefs and new realities. And when European settlers came, the mounds remained, silent, overgrown, yet unmistakably human. They were plowed, looted, ignored. The lords of Etowah had long since been buried, their copper headdresses oxidized to green dust. But their legacy endured not in conquest, but in earth and memory. So what happens to rulers when their world ends, and only the soil remembers their names? By the mid-14th century, the sacred capital of Etowah was in decline. The great mound still stood, the river still flowed, and the plaza remained, but the life of the site had dimmed. The lords no longer gathered in ritual dress, copper gleaming in the Georgia sun. The drums fell silent, and eventually the people moved on. Why? In this final section, we explore Etowah's collapse not as a cataclysm, but as a slow unweaving of ritual order. We also explore what survived. For though the rulers are nameless, their impact lingers not in kings or chronicles, but in memory, earth, and silence. Signs of the end, fading order. Unlike the abrupt abandonment of some sites, Etowah's fall appears gradual. There is no evidence of a single battle, a fire, or plague, but the clues are clear. Excavations show a decline in mound maintenance. Elite burials become rarer. The grand ceremonial artifacts, shell gorgets, copper plates, stone statues stop appearing in the archaeological layers. Construction slows. The once vibrant plaza becomes a place of absence. Most telling of all, the palisades, which had been rebuilt multiple times, are not rebuilt again. This suggests not just decline, but a loss of political will, or perhaps a withdrawal of belief in the elite's legitimacy. People may have ceased offering labor or tribute. They may have questioned the cosmological contract that bound them to their lords, or perhaps the sacred calendar that organized life could no longer explain why the rains didn't come. In a society where power is maintained through ritual performance, the end comes not with an attack, but when the audience stops watching. The earth reclaims its kings. Over the next century, Etowah's mounds were slowly abandoned. The elite compounds atop them fell into disrepair. Thatched roofs rotted. Ritual fires died out. The materials of sacred governance beads, statues, copper were buried or dispersed. The fields reverted to forest. The plaza became grass. What had once been the center of the cosmos for thousands of people became simply a hill by a river. This is the irony of ritual power. When the sacred fails to deliver, it disappears completely. And yet in that disappearance lies something enduring. The earth still held the shape of their lives. Even when the names faded, the forms remained. Mounds, patterns, symbols carved in stone. It would be centuries before anyone disturbed them. The peoples who remembered. Though Etowah as a political center declined, the people of the region did not vanish. They continued to live, farm, and worship in the river valleys of the southeast. Over generations, they shifted their settlements, adapted their beliefs, and responded to new challenges. By the 1500s, when Hernando de Soto marched through the American South, he encountered new polities: Coosa, Tallahassee, Tuscaloosa. These were powerful Mississippian societies, still organized around mound centers, tribute systems, and warrior elites. De Soto noted the presence of chiefs carried on litters, elaborate ceremonial regalia, and societies structured around sacred hierarchy. Though Etowah itself was quiet by then, its cultural framework lived on. Oral histories of later Muskogean-speaking peoples, including the Creek Confederacy, preserve stories of mound-building ancestors, sacred fireholders, and villages organized around clan councils and ceremonial grounds. In these tales, echoes of Etowah persist not in detail, but in worldview. Etowah's rulers were not forgotten. They were transformed into legend, absorbed into new systems. That too is power, colonization, and the erasure of memory. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as European settlers expanded into Georgia, the mounds of Etowah were seen not as sacred spaces but as curiosities, obstacles, or sources of treasure. They were dug up by amateurs, stripped of artifacts, and in some cases, leveled for farmland. The identities of those buried within were unknown. Their power, which had once extended over miles of territory, meant nothing to the plow. Etowah, like many indigenous sites in the southeast, suffered from archaeological extraction long before it was understood. Its stories were removed from context. Artifacts were placed in museums without names, without explanation. They became prehistoric art, detached from living cultures. And yet the earth remembered. The mounds could not be fully erased. Their size, their geometry, their alignment, they persisted, resisting oblivion. Today, the Etowah Indian mounds are protected, interpreted, respected, but much has been lost. We cannot name the rulers. We cannot read their laws. We cannot reconstruct their council decisions. What remains is the outline of a sacred world, the ruins of meaning. Was it kingship or something else? As we reflect on Etowah, we're left with the same question that lingers over many Mississippian sites. Were these societies monarchies? They had elites. They had monumental architecture. They had hereditary graves, tribute systems, and sacred authority. But they also had communal ritual, clan councils, and shared cosmologies. Their power was tied to belief, not brute force. Their legitimacy came from maintaining balance, not conquest. Unlike European kings, Etowah's lords could not pass power down forever. When ritual failed, when support dried up, when nature rebelled, they were unseated not by battle, but by silence. So perhaps king is not the right word, but neither is chief in the simple tribal sense. Etowah's rulers were custodians of cosmic order, stewards of sacred space, mediators between heaven and earth. And when they were gone, their legacy was not gold or territory, but mounds of dirt that still, quietly, reshaped the land. A final reflection. The story of Etowah challenges our understanding of power. We often think of authority in terms of laws, armies, and written proclamations. But Etwa shows us a different kind. Ritual power, grounded in symbols, performed for the people, and legitimized by nature itself. It also shows us how fragile that power can be. Because when the world changes, when crops fail, when stars fall out of alignment, when faith weakens, ritual kings fall not with blood, but with forgetting. And yet, even in forgetting, the landscape carries their memory. We walk beside rivers they once ruled. We picnic on the mounds they once stood upon. We dig up beads, unaware that they once rested on the chest of someone who was, in their world, the Sun incarnate. We live among their ruins and rarely know their names. So we end where we began. What does it mean to rule if your only monument is a hill of earth and your only legacy is a silence that echoes across centuries? Story 4. Tlatani and the voice of power ruling the Aztec Triple Alliance. In the vast valley of Mexico, where lakes once shimmered beneath snow-capped volcanoes, there rose a city unlike any other in the Americas. Built on an island in Lake Texcoco, Tenochtitlan was a marvel of engineering, planning, and power. By the early 1500s, it housed perhaps 200,000 people, one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Canals crisscrossed its neighborhoods. Temples soared above marketplaces. Causeways connected it to the mainland. And at its summit sat a single man, known as the Tlatani, literally, the one who speaks. Unlike the lords of Etwa or the consensus keepers of the Pueblo, the Tlatani was an unmistakable king, chosen, exalted, and obeyed. His word was law, his dress was sacred, his power unquestioned. And yet, even he was bound by forces older, deeper, and more dangerous than himself. This is the story of power formalized, not hidden in ritual consensus or masked in sacred architecture, but visible, declared, and enforced. This is the story of the Aztec rulers. From nomads to emperors, the Aztecs, more properly called the Mexica, were not born into greatness. For centuries, they were one of many Nahuatl-speaking peoples migrating into central Mexico after the fall of the Toltec Empire. According to their origin stories, the Mexica came from Aztlan, a mythic homeland in the north. They wandered for generations, guided by omens and gods, often scorned by more established city-states like Texcoco and Culhuacan. In time, they settled on a swampy island in Lake Texcoco around 1325 CE. This unlikely location became Tenochtitlan. The early Mexica survived as mercenaries, offering their warriors to more powerful neighbors. But over time, they grew in strength, forming alliances, marrying into noble lineages, and cultivating a fierce reputation. By the early 1400s, they joined with the cities of Texcoco and Tlacopan to form the Triple Alliance, a military and political pact that marked the beginning of Aztec empire building. At the head of this alliance, Tenochtitlan soon eclipsed its partners. And the one who ruled it, the Huey Tlatani, or Great Speaker, became the most powerful man in Mesoamerica. Tlatani, the speaker as sovereign. The title Tlatani literally means speaker, but it implies far more than the mere ability to talk. In Mexica thought, speech was a sacred act. The spoken word shaped reality. Rulers were those who spoke on behalf of the gods, the ancestors, and the empire. But Tlatani was not a hereditary title passed automatically from father to son. Rather, a noble council made up of high-ranking warriors, priests, and elders would select the new ruler, typically from a royal lineage. The chosen man had to be of noble blood, proven in battle, and deeply trained in ritual knowledge. Once selected, the Tlatani was elevated above all others. He wore the Xiuhtatl, a turquoise crown. His garments bore images of eagles, serpents, and suns. He lived apart from commoners, ate different foods, and was addressed only through formal speech. Even noblemen approached him with reverence. His duties were vast. He led military campaigns. He presided over major religious ceremonies. He managed tribute and market regulation. He oversaw the courts, though did not personally judge. He appointed officials across the empire. In every sense, he was both king and priest, general and god figure. Power built on tribute. By the time of the last Tlatoni, Moctezuma II, the Aztec Empire spanned much of central and southern Mexico. But this was not an empire in the Roman sense with roads, bureaucracies, and provincial governors enforcing unified law. Rather, the Aztec state was built on tribute. When the Mexica conquered a city-state, they did not typically replace its leaders. Instead, they required regular tribute payments: maize, cacao, cotton, jade, feathers, warriors, slaves, and more. In return, they allowed a degree of autonomy. This meant that the Tlatoni's power rested on a web of obligations, each conquered city tied to the capital by expectation, not infrastructure. Tenochtitlan's markets overflowed with goods from hundreds of miles away. The city ran on the constant flow of tribute. Aztec scribes, using pictographic codices, recorded what each province owed and when. Failing to pay meant military reprisal. This was a system held together not by roads, but by reputation, and the reputation of the Tlatoni was central. He had to be seen as victorious, favored by the gods, and ruthless when crossed. War and the Tlatoni's authority. The Tlatoni was also expected to be a warrior. From a young age, noble sons were trained in Kamikak, the elite school where they studied history, warfare, and sacred ritual. Before he could rule, a future Tlatoni had to prove himself in battle ideally, capturing enemy warriors alive for sacrifice. The Aztecs prized the flower war, a ritualized form of combat meant to capture, not kill, prisoners for ceremonial sacrifice. These wars served both religious and political purposes, reinforcing the Tlatoni's role as provider of sacred blood and upholder of cosmic balance. War was not just expansion, it was obligation. Each new Tlatoni typically launched a coronation war, asserting divine approval through battlefield success. His legitimacy was bound to conquest. Without victory, his rule could be questioned. Even Moctezuma I, one of the most powerful rulers, faced noble unrest when military campaigns stalled. Power in Tenochtitlan was visible, but it was also fragile. Temples, blood, and cosmic order. At the heart of Tenochtitlan rose the Templo Mayor, a massive pyramid with twin shrines, one to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun, the other to Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Here, the Tlatoni presided over ceremonies that ensured the universe continued. Chief among these was human sacrifice, an act not of cruelty, but of cosmic necessity. The Aztecs believed that the sun required human blood to rise each day, a debt owed from the time of creation. As speaker for the gods, the Tlatoni directed these rituals. He did not always wield the knife himself, but he organized the offerings, selected the dates, and ensured the empire provided captives. To modern eyes, this system seems brutal, but to the Mexica it was ordered, sacred, and essential. Without sacrifice, the world would end. Without the Tlatoni, sacrifice would not occur. Voice of the empire, but not absolute. Despite his grandeur, the Tlatoni was not an unchecked autocrat. He was advised by a council of nobles, including war leaders, priests, and judges. His decisions could be constrained by tradition. His conduct was scrutinized. Famine, defeat, or ritual failure could lead to loss of support or even replacement. And beneath him were layers of local rulers, Tlaloc in each city-state, who owed loyalty, but not always obedience. Aztec power was layered, negotiated, and constantly performed. Even the great speaker was speaking on behalf of others, the gods, the ancestors, the expectations of his people. But what happens when that voice falters? When the gods go silent and the speaker has no answer for what comes next? In the heart of Tenochtitlan, Beneath the shadow of the Templo Mayor, the Tlatoni presided over an empire that moved not only with conquest but with cosmic rhythm. Markets opened to the beat of sacred calendars. Wars were timed to ritual feasts. Marriages among the nobility sealed alliances as much as treaties did. Power was both personal and divine. But by the late 1400s and early 1500s, cracks were forming in this carefully balanced world. In this section, we explore the pressures on the institution of the Tlatoni from within the empire and without. For while the Aztec state appeared absolute, it was built on a foundation that could crumble if the Tlatoni failed to uphold his role as divine speaker, victorious warrior, and distributor of wealth. And the forces of collapse were already gathering. An empire of conquest, not control. At its peak, the Aztec Triple Alliance ruled over 5 to 6 million people, but it did so with a light touch, or rather, with a heavy threat. The Tlatoni did not administer each conquered region directly. He did not send governors to enforce Aztec law or reshape local customs. Instead, he relied on tribute and fear. Cities that submitted were allowed to continue their internal affairs, as long as they delivered tribute and did not rebel. If they resisted, they were often destroyed and forcibly brought into the fold. This strategy allowed for rapid expansion, but also meant the empire was a patchwork of grudging vassals, not loyal subjects. Many of these city-states like Tlaxcala, Huexotzinco, and Texcoco had long histories and their own noble dynasties. They remembered their former independence. The Tlatoni may have been he who speaks, but not everyone was listening willingly. Moctezuma II and the weight of expectation. By 1502, when Moctezuma Xocoatzin, commonly known as Moctezuma II, took the throne, the empire had reached both its geographic height and its political limits. Moctezuma had been a high priest, a judge, and a warrior before ascending. He was deeply learned, strictly devout, and viewed as a man of immense dignity and reserve, but he ruled at a time of growing tension. Internal dissent was rising, tribute demands were heavy. Resentment festered in provinces exhausted by war and forced levies. Famines had struck parts of the empire. Omens, eclipses, comets, and freak fires were interpreted as portents of doom. In this climate, the role of the Tlatoni became paradoxical. He was seen as the only one who could prevent collapse, even as collapse became more likely. Moctezuma responded by increasing the centralization of power. He distanced himself from commoners, expanded the royal palace, and consulted omens constantly. Some historians suggest he became more reclusive, relying on priests and diviners more than on generals or advisors. But for a Tlatoni, perception was everything, and to appear hesitant or isolated was to invite doubt. The speaker's voice was weakening. Spiritual fragility and the burden of omens. Aztec cosmology taught that the current age, the fifth sun, was destined to end in cataclysm. The gods had already destroyed 4 previous worlds. Humans existed by the grace of the gods, and only constant ritual and sacrifice kept the cosmic machinery running. This belief made the Tlatoni's position uniquely fragile. He was expected not only to lead politically, but to serve as a kind of cosmic technician, maintaining the flow of energy through offerings, blood, and sacred timing. By the early 1500s, a wave of ominous events was said to have occurred. A temple caught fire spontaneously. A comet blazed across the sky. A lake boiled. A 2-headed man was born, then vanished. Voices were heard in the wind, warning that disaster would come. Whether these events truly happened or were later interpretations recorded by Nahua historians after the fall of the empire, they reflected the growing anxiety in the Aztec world. Moctezuma, the most powerful man in Mesoamerica, was caught in a paradox. Divine ruler and terrified priest, expected to interpret signs he could no longer control. When news arrived that foreigners had landed on the eastern coast, it was not merely a military matter. It was cosmic confirmation. The arrival of Cortés and the collapse of authority. In 1519, Hernán Cortés and his small band of Spanish conquistadors landed on the Gulf Coast. They were quickly drawn into the politics of the region, forming alliances with the Aztecs, enemies most notably the Tlaxcalans, who had long resisted Aztec domination. Moctezuma received word of strange men, clad in metal, riding beasts never seen before horses, and wielding thunder guns. He sent gifts, hoping to appease them or perhaps to gather information. His actions have since been interpreted in many ways. Was he paralyzed by prophecy? Was he following ritual diplomacy? Did he truly believe Cortés might be the returning god Quetzalcoatl? The truth is more complex. Moctezuma likely understood the political threat, but hesitated to act decisively. He chose diplomacy, gifts, and messaging over confrontation. When Cortés finally entered Tenochtitlan, he was welcomed. And then Moctezuma was taken hostage in his own palace. For months, the city lived in surreal tension, its divine speaker held captive, still issuing orders under duress. His people grew restless. The ceremonies faltered. The sacrifices stopped. Then came the breaking point. In 1520, during a major festival, the Spaniards massacred unarmed celebrants at the Templo Mayor, fearing rebellion. The city exploded in anger. Moctezuma, still under Spanish control, tried to calm his people from a palace rooftop. He was struck by stones or perhaps killed by his captors. Accounts vary. What's clear is that the Tlaxcalani died either at the hands of his people or his enemies, a symbol of a cosmic system that could no longer hold. A power vacuum and the end of the empire. After Moctezuma's death, the Aztecs elected Cuitlahuac, his brother, to lead resistance. He died shortly after from smallpox. The next Tlaxcalani, Cuauhtémoc, led a fierce defense of Tenochtitlan, but the city fell in 1521 after months of siege, starvation, and disease. With the death of Cuauhtémoc, the office of Tlaxcalani ceased to exist in its full power. The man who had once spoken for the gods was replaced by colonial authorities, priests, and governors. Aztec nobility was co-opted. The sacred calendar was suppressed. The Templo Mayor was razed, and a Spanish cathedral built in its place. The voice of the empire fell silent, remembering the Tlaxcalani. And yet the memory remained. The Nahua people continued to tell their stories. Some Tlaxcalani were remembered not as failures, but as tragic heroes, struggling against fate and foreign disease. Their titles persisted in local records. Their speeches recorded in Nahuatl by native scribes still echo with dignity and complexity. Modern Mexico City still rests atop the ruins of Tenochtitlan. The stone of Tizoc, the feathered headdresses, and the codices bear witness to a time when a single man stood at the center of a world held together by blood, stars, and words. But in the end, the voice of the Tlaxcalani could not hold back a tide of change. So we must ask, when a king's voice shapes the cosmos, what happens when the world stops listening? By 1521, the empire ruled from Tenochtitlan had fallen. The Tlaxcalani, once the embodiment of divine speech, cosmic balance, and earthly authority, was gone. In his place stood foreign generals, priests, and administrators. The great city had been reduced to ruins. The temples toppled, the markets silenced. The sacred order, it seemed, had been extinguished. But power, even when silenced, leaves echoes. This final section examines what happened after the death of the Tlaxcalani. It follows the fragments of Aztec sovereignty into the colonial world, into memory, into reinterpretation, and, ultimately, into the present. For although the office was abolished, the idea of Tlaxcalani as ruler, speaker, and spiritual mediator would take new forms in the centuries that followed. Sometimes hidden, sometimes altered but never entirely gone. The survivors, nobility under Spanish rule. After the conquest, the Spanish did not annihilate the Mexican nobility. Instead, they sought to co-opt it. This was both practical and strategic. The surviving Pipiltin, the hereditary nobles of Tenochtitlan and surrounding Altepetl city-states, were familiar with leadership, tribute collection, and organizing labor. The Spanish allowed many of them to retain local authority, now under the title of indigenous governor. These new leaders were baptized, taught Spanish, and often educated in Christian doctrine. But within their communities, they continued to wield significant influence, sometimes preserving Nahuatl law, landholdings, and even ancestral ceremonies, though often in secret. Former Tlatok, plural of Tlatoni, became intermediaries between colonizers and indigenous communities. Some even maintained noble privileges under colonial law. In the Valley of Mexico, indigenous lords continued to sign documents with glyphs or symbolic marks, preserving visual links to their pre-Hispanic status. Spanish friars, meanwhile, relied on these nobles to help with religious conversion, sometimes deliberately blurring the line between local authority and spiritual guidance. But the Tlatoni was no longer sacred. He was no longer the voice of the gods. He had become a bureaucrat in a system designed to erase the very cosmos he once upheld. Codices, memory, and historical resistance. One of the most remarkable acts of preservation came from indigenous scribes themselves. In the decades after conquest, Nahua writers began producing historical codices, legal petitions, and annals that blended traditional pictographic methods with alphabetic writing introduced by Spanish friars. These documents recorded lineages, tribute demands, land rights, and the stories of the Tlatoni not as propaganda, but as memory. Works like the Codex Mendoza, the Florentine Codex, and the Annals of Tlatelolco were created by native hands, often under Spanish supervision, but with embedded layers of indigenous meaning. In these texts, the Tlatoni is often presented with dignity, complexity, and even defiance. His words are recorded in oratory that rivals the speeches of classical antiquity, full of poetry, metaphor, and cosmic philosophy. In one famous imagined farewell, Cuauhtémoc addresses his warriors before surrendering. "We are Mexica, we have done all we could. The sun has set, but we shall return from the land of the dead." Whether historical or poetic, these lines reflect a deep mourning not only for a ruler, but for a worldview. Yet even in mourning, the speakers speak. The tradition of Tlatoni, the one who speaks, survives in the act of remembering. Repression and the survival of ritual. Under Spanish rule, indigenous religious practices were harshly repressed. Temples were destroyed, idols burned, ceremonies outlawed. The priesthood that had once supported the Tlatoni was scattered. But traditions do not vanish so easily. Many ritual practices were preserved in disguised form, adapted into Christian festivals, reframed under the names of saints, or practiced in private. Some sacred sites were rededicated but not forgotten. In rural areas, Cofradias Catholic brotherhoods often took on the role of preserving indigenous social cohesion, sometimes functioning much like old Cowpoli, clan, or neighborhood councils. Within them, elected positions echoed the old ritual hierarchies of the Altepetl. Even centuries later, Nahuatl-speaking communities in central Mexico would organize their year around ritual cycles, some still tied to agricultural deities long suppressed. The Tlatoni might be gone, but ritual, or the real basis of power in the pre-Hispanic world, still flickered beneath the surface. The Tlatoni in national memory. In modern Mexican history, the Aztec past has been reclaimed, repurposed, and romanticized, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, as national identity formed around indigenous roots. Moctezuma II became a symbol of tragic nobility. Cuauhtémoc, the last Tlatoani, became a national hero cast as a defiant warrior who resisted foreign conquest to the bitter end. Statues of him stand in Mexico City, sword raised. Streets bear his name. But these commemorations often sanitize the complexity of Aztec rule. They reduce the Tlatoani to either tyrant or martyr, ignoring the intricate political, spiritual, and philosophical systems that sustain the office for generations. Yet the very fact that Tlatoani are remembered, named, spoken of, debated is a testament to their lasting influence. They were never just kings. They were symbols of cosmic order, the ones who made the world intelligible. And though the cosmos changed, the need for meaning did not. Modern echoes, who speaks for the people today? In indigenous communities across Mexico, leadership continues to reflect the principles that once shaped the Tlatoani. Local officials in Nahuatl-speaking pueblos are still called Tlatohuani in ceremonial speech. Community decisions are made through councils, with rotating offices and ritual responsibilities. Orators still speak in formal Nahuatl at festivals, invoking ancestors and the natural world. The concept of tequio, collective labor in service of the community, remains a living practice. In some cases, these traditions have been recognized in Mexican law as part of indigenous autonomy. The voice of the Tlatoani has not returned in the old form, but its function has not disappeared. In new contexts, under new names, people still seek leaders who balance spiritual responsibility, oratory, and public duty. They still need someone to speak for the people, even if that voice no longer comes from a palace on an island. A voice that never truly died. The Aztec Tlatoani was a king, a priest, a general, and a symbol. His power lay in his ability to unify belief and action, ritual and rule, speech and silence. When the empire fell, that voice was silenced. But like the sacred sun in Aztec myth, which died each night and rose again through sacrifice, the legacy of the Tlatoani has continued not in domination, but in memory. You can hear it in the oral histories passed down through Nahua families. You can see it in the glyph, still etched into stones, once buried in colonial cathedrals. You can feel it in the structure of language itself in Nahuatl. To speak is not passive, it is to create. And so, the Tlatoani may be gone, but the world he spoke into being still echoes in corners of a modern nation that rests on the ruins of his city. In the end, the question remains. When the voice of power falls silent, what remains louder, the memory of speech or the silence that follows? Story 5. The Highland Strategist's Inca Empire and the Logic of Centralized Control. In the cold, thin air of the Andes, where jagged peaks cut the sky and rivers plunge into valleys thousands of feet below, a quiet revolution in governance took place. By the 15th century, a small highland city called Cusco had become the beating heart of the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas, the Tawantinsuyu, or the four parts together. Spanning nearly 2,500 miles from modern-day Colombia to central Chile, the Inca Empire was a marvel of coordination. It was held together not by writing, not by wheels, not by marketplaces, but by roads, runners, and rigid organization. At its head was the Sapa Inca, the unique Inca, a man believed to be descended from the sun itself. But unlike the Tlatoani of the Aztecs, who ruled a patchwork of tribute-based dependencies, the Sapa Inca governed through a strategy of absorptive control, turning rival cultures into nodes of an integrated, hierarchical, and meticulously managed imperial system. This is the story of centralized authority, writ large across mountains. The birth of an empire in stone and story. According to Inca legend, the first rulers emerged from the sacred cave of Pacarictampu, guided by the sun god Inti. They journeyed through the highlands, eventually settling in Cusco, a navel of the world. Historically, The Inca began as one of many small ethnic groups in the Cusco Valley. It wasn't until the 1430s, under Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, that the tide shifted. A charismatic and visionary leader, Pachacuti reorganized Cusco into an imperial capital, launched military campaigns, and laid the groundwork for a vast bureaucracy. His successors Topa Inca Yupanqui and Huayna Capac continued the expansion, using military might, diplomacy, strategic marriages, and infrastructure to bring dozens of ethnic groups and territories into the fold. By the time the Spanish arrived in the early 1530s, the Inca Empire ruled over an estimated 10 to 12 million people, spanning ecological zones as diverse as tropical forests, coastal deserts, and glaciated peaks. And they did it all without a written language. The Sapa Inca, divine and untouchable. The Sapa Inca was not merely a king, he was a living deity. Believed to be the direct descendant of Inti, he served as both sovereign and spiritual figure. His person was sacred, his voice was law, his garments were relics. No one could touch him directly. He was carried on a golden litter, veiled by fine cloth. Even his exhaled breath was considered too holy to be encountered without ritual preparation. His image was replicated in statues and woven portraits, placed in provinces to act as his spiritual emissaries. The Sapa Inca was omnipresent, both physically and symbolically. But unlike Aztec rulers, who were chosen by council and expected to prove themselves in battle, the Sapa Inca ruled by lineage. Succession passed to one of his sons, typically not the eldest, but the one deemed most capable and favored by court factions. Once chosen, the new Sapa Inca had to consolidate power quickly, securing loyalty from nobles, generals, and provincial administrators. The process could be smooth, or it could spark civil war. But at its core, Inca rulership was not about temporary prestige, it was about embodying the state itself. The logic of centralization, how the empire functioned. Where the Aztec Empire was held together by tribute, the Inca Empire operated through a more intrusive system of control. It was, in many ways, bureaucratic without writing. The empire was divided into 4 regions, the Sayas, each with its own capital and administrative hierarchy. These regions were then subdivided into provinces, districts, and kin-based units called islas. Every household was registered and categorized. Officials were appointed to supervise groups of 10 households, Chunka Kamyuk; 100 households, Pachaka Kamyuk; 1,000 households, Waranka Kamyuk; 10,000 households, Hunu Kamyuk. Each level reported to the next, forming a top-down chain of command. Everything from crop production to road labor was tracked using Quipus, the knot-based record-keeping system managed by trained Kipukamyuk. Labor was the empire's currency. Instead of taxes in goods or money, citizens paid Amida a labor obligation. One might be assigned to build a road, terrace a mountainside, or serve in the army or state warehouses for part of the year. In return, the state provided security, stored food, and ritual integration. It was not a free society, but it was highly organized and shockingly effective. Infrastructure of rule, roads, runners, and storage. The Inca invested heavily in infrastructure, understanding that information and goods were essential to control. The Quhapac Nyan, or Royal Road, stretched over 24,000 miles, an astonishing feat of mountain engineering. Tambos, or way stations, were placed at regular intervals, offering food and shelter to travelers and administrators. The Chasqui relay system employed trained runners who could deliver messages across hundreds of miles in days. Calca's state storage facilities were stocked with dried food, textiles, tools, and weapons. The effect was extraordinary. A non-literate empire that could mobilize vast resources, respond to natural disasters, and move armies quickly through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. This system reflected the logic of the Sapa Inca, omnipresent, watchful, and organized. He did not rely on provincial loyalty, he replaced it with state structure. Integration through ritual and language. The Inca were pragmatists. They allowed subject peoples to keep their gods and local customs so long as they recognized the supremacy of the Inca pantheon, particularly Inti, the sun god, and Viracocha, the creator. At conquered sites, the Inca often built sun temples alongside local shrines, physically demonstrating the layering of spiritual authority. They relocated elite families to Cusco, trained them in Quechua, and then sent them back as loyal administrators. This was known as Mitma forced resettlement, used to disperse rebellious groups, populate underused land, or integrate newcomers. Language and ritual were central tools of unity. Quechua was promoted across the empire, even as local dialects were tolerated. The Inti Raymi festival celebrating the sun's return after winter became a statewide ceremony, reinforcing the Sapa Inca's divine role. The state did not erase difference, it absorbed it. This absorption was power, the hidden fragility. And yet, for all its organization, the Inca Empire had structural weaknesses. Its reliance on personal authority meant succession crises could destabilize everything. Its control was based on constant management disruption of roads, food supplies, or records could unravel the system. Its power was top-heavy, too centralized, to allow local initiative during emergencies. And crucially, it lacked writing. Quipus were powerful but required interpreters and could not convey narrative orders across generations. In 1527, the empire reached a breaking point. Huayna Capac, the reigning Sapa Inca, died likely of smallpox, introduced by European contact on the northern frontier. A civil war broke out between his sons, Atahualpa and Huascar. It was in this moment of internal fracture that a small band of Spanish soldiers, led by Francisco Pizarro, arrived on the coast. They found an empire wounded, confused, and overextended. And soon, the Sapa Inca would find that control, even cosmic control, could shatter in the face of the unexpected. How can the most organized empire fall? Not from external conquest, but from a silence in its chain of command. In the final years of the 1520s, the sun shone brightly over the Andean highlands, but the empire it had long blessed was growing shadowed with uncertainty. The tightly wound, hierarchical machine built by the Inca, from the quipu-bearing administrators to the food-storing Calcas, began to unravel, not from external invasion, but from something far more insidious: succession without clarity. And in a system where everything depended on the central authority of the Sapa Inca, ambiguity was deadly. In this section, we explore how the internal fractures of the Inca world's strategic miscalculations, inheritance disputes, and brittle bureaucracy set the stage for its rapid downfall. While the Spanish conquest is often told as a tale of superior weapons and divine luck, the truth is more systemic. The Inca Empire collapsed because it was already cracking from within. The death that broke the empire. In 1527, Huayna Capac, the Inca emperor who had ruled for over 30 years, died in the northern city of Quito. He had been on a campaign to consolidate Inca control in the north when illness struck. The likely culprit, smallpox, introduced by Europeans advancing through the Caribbean and Panama before any Spaniard had reached the Inca heartland. The death of a Sapa Inca was always a moment of tension, but this time it triggered something worse: a civil war. Huayna Capac had not clearly designated a successor. His eldest son, Huascar, was in Cusco and considered the rightful heir by many nobles. But another son, Atahualpa, remained in Quito, where he had strong support from military leaders and northern generals loyal to his father's memory. What followed was a brutal and prolonged power struggle. Two sons of the sun god, each claiming the divine mantle of sovereignty. Two courts, two armies, two interpretations of legitimacy. For the Inca state, which relied on a central, unquestioned authority, this duality was existentially dangerous. A civil war of bureaucracies. This wasn't just a war between personalities, it was a war between state structures. Each side had its own administrators, generals, local governors, and sources of tribute. Each tried to absorb and redirect the empire's vast infrastructure. Provinces had to choose whom to support. Roads that once carried messages to a single Cusco were now conduits of rebellion. Quipus were burned, tambos ransacked. Atahualpa, with experienced generals like Chalcachima and Quisquis, proved the better strategist. After years of fighting, his forces captured Cusco, executed Huascar's family, and began consolidating power. But victory came at a terrible cost. Tens of thousands died. Crops failed. Administrative order collapsed. Loyalty fractured. And just as Atahualpa stood on the verge of fully claiming the empire, a new force arrived from the coast. The arrival of the unexpected. In late 1532, Francisco Pizarro and his band of fewer than 200 Spanish soldiers arrived at the highland town of Cajamarca. They had heard rumors of gold, of a great empire weakened by internal strife, and of a god-king who had not yet stabilized his realm. Atahualpa, fresh from victory, agreed to meet the foreigners. He was supremely confident. He had an army of 80,000 nearby. He had no reason to fear. But he misunderstood the stakes, and so did his advisors. What happened next was not a battle, it was an ambush, a spectacle, and a collapse of protocol. When Atahualpa entered Cajamarca's plaza for a formal meeting, he was seized in a surprise attack. His litter-bearers were cut down. His body was not harmed, but his sovereignty was destroyed. The Spanish, using horses, firearms, and shock tactics, routed the royal entourage in minutes. And just like that, the living son was in a dark room, held prisoner by men who did not speak his language. The chain of command snaps. The Inca state was hierarchical, centralized, and dependent on obedience to the Sapa Inca's commands. So what happens when that voice is captured? Chaos. Atahualpa, still revered by many, tried to rule from captivity. He issued orders. He negotiated. He offered the now legendary ransom, a room filled with gold and two with silver, in exchange for his release. This ransom was collected and delivered. It did not save him. Meanwhile, local administrators hesitated. Without clear succession and with conflicting messages, governors didn't know whom to obey. The bureaucracy froze. The runners fell silent. Mitma colonies waited for orders that never came. And Pizarro moved swiftly. Divide, co-opt, replace. The Spanish, vastly outnumbered but politically agile, did not try to destroy the Inca system, they usurped it. They freed Huascar's surviving family members, only to kill them later. They set up puppet emperors, including Manco Inca, who ruled under Spanish supervision. They kept Quipus, recruited native administrators, and used existing infrastructure to extend their reach. By the time they marched into Cusco, the city was more exhausted than conquered. Manco Inca would later rebel, leading a major uprising in 1536, but by then, the unity of Tawantinsuyu was gone. Provincial loyalties had frayed, roads were blocked, food stores had been looted or withheld. The Inca had created a system that required perfect alignment of central command, and once broken, it could not be easily repaired. The empire without its son. After Atahualpa's execution in 1533, the office of Sapa Inca was effectively severed from its sacred roots. Subsequent puppet rulers lacked legitimacy. Local rebellions surged. Some regions tried to assert independence, but none could fully revive the empire. The Spanish, recognizing the efficiency of Inca infrastructure, preserved much of it in the early years. The road system remained in use. Local governors were retained. Even Mita labor was transformed into colonial and encomienda labor. But the cosmological glue was gone. The sun no longer ruled. And without the divine presence of the Sapa Inca, the empire became just land. A world unraveled by fragility. Why did the Inca Empire fall so quickly? Historians continue to debate the causes, but the collapse can be traced to several interconnected weaknesses. Hypercentralization. Without redundancy, any break at the top threatened the entire system. No written continuity. Quipus, while powerful, could not preserve nuanced history or policy during crisis. Lack of internal consensus. Civil war had already weakened trust and capacity. Spiritual dependence on a single figure. When the Sapa Inca was captured, the world order cracked. In some ways, the Inca were victims of their own brilliance. Their system had worked so well for so long that they had no experience in decentralized response or shared governance. And when everything depended on a single voice, silence became fatal. If a state is built to follow only one man, what happens when that man falls and there's no one left to speak for the sun? The year is 1533. The last uncontested Sapa Inca, Atahualpa, has been strangled by the Spanish after delivering the most infamous ransom in world history. Gold and silver have changed hands. The capital of Cusco has fallen. The empire of Tawantinsuyu, so recently the greatest power in South America, appears to have crumbled. But empires do not die neatly, especially not one so deeply rooted in ritual, memory, and land. In this final section, we follow the afterlife of the Inca Empire, its attempted restorations, its spiritual echoes, and its enduring imprint on the highland Andes. Though centralized authority collapsed, the idea of Inca sovereignty never truly vanished. It lingered in mountains, in textiles, in whispered songs, and even in revolts centuries later. What we see is not only the fall of a system, but the long negotiation with its shadow. The Neo-Inca state of Vilcabamba. After Cusco fell, the Spanish crowned a young prince, Manco Inca Yupanqui, as a puppet ruler. But Manco was no fool. In 1536, after enduring humiliation and fearing execution, he launched a massive rebellion. For nearly a year, tens of thousands of warriors laid siege to Cusco. The Spanish barely held the city. Though the uprising ultimately failed, Manco escaped into the eastern highlands, where thick cloud forests and narrow passes made pursuit difficult. There, he established the Neo-Inca state of Vilcabamba, a refuge kingdom that lasted for 36 years, from 1536 to 1572. It was a remarkable attempt to preserve Inca sovereignty. Though lacking the size and infrastructure of the old empire, Vilcabamba retained a court with royal ceremony and Inca regalia, priests and Quipucamyuc, continuing ritual life, diplomatic envoys sent to other native groups and even to Spanish officials, a symbolic claim to legitimacy over all Andean peoples. 4 Sapa Inca rulers reigned in Vilcabamba. The last, Tupac Amaru I, was captured and executed by the Spanish in 1572. With his death, the final political thread of Inca authority was severed. Or so it seemed. Persistence in the landscape and ritual. Even without a royal court, the cosmology of the Inca remained embedded in the landscape itself. Mountains, rivers, and sacred stones called huacas continued to receive offerings. Farmers still planted and harvested according to the sex system, a ritual mapping of space around Cusco. The sun, moon, and earth were still honored in ways both public and private. Catholic authorities tried to suppress these practices. Priests destroyed huacas, banned Quechua ceremonies, and punished native ritual specialists. But often, syncretism took root. The sun god Inti became associated with Jesus or Saint James. The Pachamama, Earth Mother, was subtly honored during Catholic feasts. Festivals like Inti Raymi were banned, then returned under Christianized forms. The Andes themselves held the memory of Inca order. Roads remained. Ruins stood as silent proof, and even as the empire was gone, the people still walked through it every day. Textiles and oral memory as political survival. In a world without writing, the Inca had always encoded meaning in other media. Quipuas carried numerical and administrative data. Textiles with their geometric designs conveyed social status, origin, and cosmological principles. Oral tradition songs, prayers, and stories passed on historical memory, often through generations of specialists. After the fall, these forms became even more vital. Women wove resistance into clothing, using patterns that defied colonial norms. Elders taught myths of Inca origin, sometimes cloaked in Christian symbolism. Rebel leaders invoked Inca ancestry as political legitimacy. This was not nostalgia, it was continuity under pressure. The empire had fallen, but the world it organized was still being spoken. Rebellions in the name of the Inca. In the 18th century, long after the empire's collapse, the Inca identity re-emerged in the most direct way. In 1780, a mestizo muleteer and minor nobleman in southern Peru, José Gabriel Condorcanqui, claimed descent from Tupac Amaru I, taking the name Tupac Amaru II. He launched a massive anti-colonial revolt against Spanish authorities, oppressive taxation, and forced labor systems. His rebellion gathered tens of thousands of indigenous and mestizo supporters. Though brutally suppressed, it terrified the Spanish colonial state and planted the seeds for future independence movements across Latin America. Tupac Amaru II was captured and executed, dismembered in a public square. But his name and the Inca legacy he invoked became a powerful symbol of resistance, justice, and ancestral pride. Later rebels, revolutionaries, and thinkers in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador would continue to invoke the Inca past as a model for sovereignty. Modern nationhood and the Inca image. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as Latin American countries gained independence, the Inca were reimagined in national mythologies. In Peru, the Inca became a symbol of golden antiquity, advanced, wise, tragically noble. Cusco was declared the historical capital of the nation. The Inti Raymi festival, banned for centuries, was revived in the 1940s, now a mix of pageantry, tourism, and cultural pride. But the real descendants of the empire, Quechua-speaking indigenous communities, often remained marginalized. The same states that celebrated Machu Picchu and Sun festivals imposed Spanish-only education, land seizures, and political exclusion. The Inca, once rulers, became romantic figures in tourist brochures, separated from the living people who still held onto pieces of their culture. And yet the memory persisted. A fragmented but unbroken legacy. Today, across the Andean highlands, remnants of Inca governance still flicker. Communities organize agricultural work through Ilu systems. Ritual calendars mark planting, harvest, and solstice. Quechua, once the imperial lingua franca, is still spoken by millions. Local leaders are chosen in systems that mirror Inca reciprocal authority. These are not fossilized traditions. They are living systems, adapted and resilient. The Sapa Inca may be gone, but in a very real sense, Tawantinsuyu never entirely died. Its logic of organizing society around reciprocity, land stewardship, ritual, and hierarchy still shapes Andean life. A final thought. The Inca ruled through strategy, centralization, and infrastructure. Their empire was efficient, expansive, and by many measures astonishing in its achievements. But it was also brittle. Its greatest strength, the central, sacred authority of the Sapa Inca, was also its greatest vulnerability. When that figure was lost, the system cracked. And yet, power does not always need palaces. Sometimes it survives in roads still walked, languages still spoken, and rituals still held quietly on mountaintops. In the silence that followed the fall, the Inca world did not disappear. It became the ground beneath the feet of those who never stopped remembering. So we ask, when a state falls, is it truly gone if the people still live by its rhythms, speak its words, and look to the sun as they did before? Story 6. The Haudenosaunee Great Law Diplomacy Over Domination. When Europeans first pushed into the dense, rolling forests of the Northeast in the 1600s, they encountered a political formation that challenged their expectations. There were no crowned kings, no golden idols, no standing armies in shining armor, but there was order, structured, ritualized, and strikingly stable. They had entered the domain of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, a political system so sophisticated that centuries later, it would be cited as an influence on the formation of the U.S. Constitution. Yet its power was not based on conquest, not on tribute, not on divine monarchy. It was based on agreement, a living, oral constitution known as the Great Law of Peace. This is the story of a civilization that built unity without empire, stability without hierarchy, and resilience through diplomacy. It begins, not with war but with a peacemaker in a canoe crossing a lake. The world before the law. The story begins long before European arrival, in what is now upstate New York and southern Ontario, when the region was populated by warring nations the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. They spoke closely related Iroquoian languages, shared trade networks, and had similar cultural traditions. But they were often locked in cycles of blood feud and retribution raids, revenge, and ritual warfare that devastated communities over generations. Each nation had its own clan system, council, and oral laws, but there was no overarching peace, no mechanism to stop the fighting. It was in this context, as legend tells, that a spiritual figure emerged known simply as the peacemaker. He was not a warrior. He was not a king. In some versions, he had a speech impediment and needed others to speak for him, but he carried a message that would transform the political future of the region. The peacemaker and the founding of a confederacy. The Great Law of Peace, as remembered and passed down through oral tradition, was not a single event, but a long process of persuasion. The peacemaker traveled from nation to nation, preaching the end of vengeance and the possibility of unity. With him was the famed orator Hiawatha, who could give voice to the peacemaker's message. Their goal was revolutionary: to replace blood feud with consensus, to stop cycles of war through the creation of a council of equals, and to root law in the natural world in the white pine, whose roots reached out in all directions. The most difficult challenge was convincing Tadadaho, a powerful and violent Onondaga leader said to be twisted in body and mind. Only when Tadadaho was healed, symbolically straightened through ritual and forgiveness, could peace take hold. With his ascent, the 5 nations formed a confederacy. Mohawk K-A-N-I-E-N adjective K-E-H-A-K, keepers of the eastern door. Oneida Anyateka. Onondaga Honornidagaga, keepers of the central fire. Cayuga Geagaho and letter Wenaba adjective. Seneca O-N-O-M-Not-D-O-W-I adjective G, keepers of the western door. Together they became the Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse. This metaphor of the Longhouse, stretching east to west across their territory, captured the essence of their union. Separate fires shared shelter. A constitution without paper. The Great Law of Peace is one of the most enduring and least understood political systems in the Americas. It was never written down in the pre-colonial era. Its principles were passed orally, memorized by designated wampum keepers who used wampum belts, beaded mnemonic devices, to encode key events and laws. And yet the structure was remarkably clear. Each nation sent clan representatives, or sachems, to a central grand council. Decisions were made by consensus, not majority rule. If full agreement was not reached, the matter was set aside and revisited later. Sachems were chosen by clan mothers, the matriarchs who held ultimate authority to appoint and remove leaders. No individual held supreme power. The Onondaga, as keepers of the central fire, hosted the council and facilitated discussion. The system prioritized balance, deliberation, and collective memory. Laws were rooted in the natural world and in the well-being of future generations, 7 generations into the future, by some traditions. There were no jails, no written contracts, no monarchs. But there was peace. Diplomacy as a mode of power. Unlike the Aztecs or Inca, the Haudenosaunee did not build temples or wage expansive wars of conquest. Their strength was measured not in land taken, but in relationships managed. Their council system extended into foreign policy. The Confederacy spoke with one voice to outsiders. This unity gave them a distinct advantage when European powers arrived in the 1600s, jockeying for influence, trade, and territory. The Haudenosaunee became masterful diplomats, forming and breaking alliances with the Dutch, French, British, and later Americans. They played colonial powers against each other, negotiated treaties, and used their internal structure to make measured decisions under enormous pressure. Their influence stretched beyond their immediate territory. Through their ceremonial diplomacy, known as condolence councils, they welcomed other indigenous nations into orbit around the Confederacy, sometimes referred to as the Iroquois League. They exerted power not through conquest, but through inclusion. The council fire burned steady. At the center of the Haudenosaunee world was the Grand Council fire, not a literal fire, but a political and spiritual symbol. To sit at the council fire was to be part of the decision-making body, to have voice. Sachems did not represent only themselves or their nation. They spoke for their clan, their ancestors, and the future generations yet unborn. Debate could take days, sometimes weeks, but the principle of unanimity was sacred. If a single clan disapproved, discussions would pause, alliances reconsidered, the question reframed. This system was not efficient. It was not quick, but it was remarkably stable, especially for a system without jails, standing armies, or taxation. Power was not enforced, it was negotiated, and maintained through ritual, kinship, and respect. But can any system, no matter how balanced, hold fast when the world around it begins to burn? As the 17th century turned into the 18th, the world around the Haudenosaunee Confederacy changed at a pace faster than any oral tradition could anticipate. The arrival of European colonial powers, first Dutch, then English and French, brought guns, disease, and a new kind of warfare. Not raids for revenge or captives, but global contests for land, wealth, and domination. Into this growing storm stepped a confederacy designed for deliberation, not domination. The Haudenosaunee responded not by abandoning their system, but by adapting it. Through diplomacy, alliances, and strategic neutrality, they maintained a balance of power that even European powers respected for a time. But a confederacy held together by consensus would soon find itself split by foreign wars, forced migrations, and internal divisions. And still, the council fire burned. From furs to firearms, entering the global economy. In the early 1600s, the Haudenosaunee became key players in the fur trade, especially after forging trade ties with the Dutch at Fort Orange, modern-day Albany, New York. In return for pelts, mostly beaver, they received steel tools, cloth, and most crucially, guns. The acquisition of firearms altered the balance of power in the region. The Haudenosaunee now had the means to protect trade routes, defend against raids, and even expand their influence westward. This expansion, known to historians as the Beaver Wars, was a period of intense regional conflict. Armed with Dutch and later English guns, Haudenosaunee warriors conducted campaigns into the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes, and as far south as Virginia. Their goal: control over hunting grounds and trade networks. But these weren't wars of empire. They were strategic disruptions aimed at controlling flow, not territory. The Confederacy was adapting, but the outside world was growing more volatile. The French threat and the Jesuit intrusion. To the north, the French allied with Algonquian-speaking nations, enemies of the Haudenosaunee. As tensions mounted, the Confederacy found itself drawn into European geopolitical conflict. The French dispatched Jesuit missionaries into Haudenosaunee land. Some welcomed, others met with suspicion or violence. The Jesuits sought conversion, peace, and influence. They built missions and wrote detailed ethnographies of Haudenosaunee life, some of the earliest Western records of the Confederacy. But to Haudenosaunee leaders, the French were dangerous meddlers, both religiously and politically. Their alliances with enemy tribes and military incursions led to violent confrontations. In 1687, French forces attacked Seneca villages, burning crops and homes. In response, the Confederacy launched raids into New France. By the late 1600s, the Haudenosaunee were simultaneously negotiating with, fighting against, and trading alongside multiple colonial powers. It was an impossible balance. The Covenant Chain, a fragile alliance with the English. Seeking to outmaneuver the French, the Haudenosaunee entered into a diplomatic alliance with the English known as the Covenant Chain, a series of treaties and meetings that established mutual defense and trade agreements. This alliance, forged in the late 1600s, was based on symbolism as much as policy. The covenant was symbolized by silver chains, polished to prevent corrosion, a metaphor for ongoing dialogue and mutual respect. Each link represented obligation. Each polishing represented renewal of friendship. At first, the English respected this framework. Haudenosaunee leaders, such as Canasatigo, spoke eloquently at colonial conferences, urging the colonies to unite in purpose, just as the Haudenosaunee had under the Great Law of Peace. Benjamin Franklin and others admired the Confederacy system. Some even argued that the American colonies should adopt a similar model of intercolonial cooperation, a historical point that continues to spark scholarly debate. But as English colonial expansion pushed westward, the covenant frayed. The land-hungry colonists no longer wanted partners, they wanted property. Internal strain and external pressure. By the mid-1700s, the Haudenosaunee faced enormous challenges. Epidemics had reduced populations dramatically. Land cessions, often made under pressure or by individual nations, weakened territorial integrity. Missionary activity and Christian conversion created cultural divides within communities. New generations of leaders had to choose between resisting change and adapting to survive. And then came the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, known in the colonies as the French and Indian War. Once again, the Haudenosaunee tried to maintain neutrality, balancing between French and English interests. But neutrality was becoming impossible. Individual nations and clans began choosing sides, fracturing the unity of the Confederacy. Some joined British campaigns, others aligned with the French. Some tried to sit out the conflict entirely. When the war ended in British victory, the colonial frontier exploded with settler expansion, broken promises, and new pressures. The council fire flickered, but it had not gone out. Revolution and rupture. In 1776, the American Revolution exploded across the eastern seaboard. For the Haudenosaunee, it was not their war, but it would become their breaking point. Faced with pressure from both the rebelling colonies and the British Crown, the Confederacy splintered. For the first time in living memory, the five nations were no longer unified in diplomacy or war. The Mohawk, led by the charismatic war chief Joseph Brant Thayendanegea, sided with the British. The Oneida and Tuscarora, the latter having joined the Confederacy in the 18th century to form the Six Nations, backed the American revolutionaries. The Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca tried to stay neutral or lean toward Britain, viewing it as the lesser threat. The Confederacy's unity, its greatest strength, was shattered by a war not of its making. American forces responded with devastating campaigns. In 1779, the Sullivan Expedition, ordered by George Washington, burned more than 40 Haudenosaunee towns, destroying crops and displacing thousands. Survivors fled to Canada, where they rebuilt some communities under British protection. The Confederacy was no longer a single longhouse. After the fire, what survives? Despite war, displacement, and division, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy did not vanish. In Canada, communities re-established themselves on reserves along the Grand River and elsewhere. The council system continued in adapted forms, with sachems still chosen by clan mothers, and wampum belts preserved in private and ceremonial archives. In the United States, land was lost through treaties, fraud, and force, but Haudenosaunee nations such as the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and the Onondaga Nation of New York persisted, maintaining sovereign status into the present day. The great law of peace was never broken. It was simply pushed underground, held in memory, ceremony, and the quiet authority of clan mothers who continued to choose leaders long after the outsiders had stopped listening. Can a system survive when scattered across borders, divided by war, and forgotten by history if the people within it still carry its fire? In the centuries following the American Revolution, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was fractured, displaced, and by many outside observers declared obsolete. But within the communities themselves, something crucial remained. Even as colonial governments imposed reservations, boarding schools, and elected band councils, the original great law of peace endured not as a relic, but as a living constitution, still recited, still guiding relationships, and still used to name leaders. This final section explores how the Confederacy survived dismemberment, how memory became a form of resistance, and how in the modern world, the great law continues to inform both indigenous sovereignty and global thinking on democracy. The Haudenosaunee never called their leaders kings. They called them holders of the fire. And the fire still burns. Wampum belts and the archive of memory. The great law of peace was never written down in the way Europeans documented their legal systems. Instead, it lived in oral form, encoded in ceremonial speech and wampum belts, carefully woven strings of shell beads that recorded events, laws, and agreements. One of the most important is the Hiawatha Belt, which symbolically depicts the original five nations linked in unity, with the central tree representing the Onondaga at the center. Others commemorate treaties, alliances, and even invasions. These belts were not art. They were living documents, interpreted by wampum keepers, a role passed down carefully through generations. The belts had legal force, and reciting them was a public act of governance. In the 19th century, as colonial authorities attempted to dismantle traditional systems, many wampum belts were stolen, sold, or held by museums and private collectors. But some remained with the nations. Others have been repatriated in recent decades. They are not just symbols, they are the constitution of a still living political body. Matriarchy and the power to choose. While colonial systems often assumed male dominance, the Haudenosaunee had long operated under a matrilineal and matriarchal social order. Clan identity was passed through the mother's line. Clan mothers, Yakchainer, held the power to nominate and remove male sachems, leaders. Decisions about land, resources, and peace were made in consultation with women elders. Even in the most intense moments of colonial pressure, matrilineal power persisted. In the 19th century, Seneca leader Ely S. Parker, who served as secretary to Ulysses S. Grant, was appointed by a clan mother. His rise to national influence did not begin with the U.S. Army, it began with Haudenosaunee tradition. The persistence of female political authority remains one of the most distinctive and enduring elements of Haudenosaunee governance. In a world still wrestling with gender equity, it serves as a reminder that alternative systems have long existed and functioned well. Dual governance and the question of recognition. By the early 20th century, colonial governments in Canada and the United States attempted to replace traditional governance with elected councils under the Indian Act, Canada, and Federal Recognition Policy, U.S. These systems were designed to be legible to the state, structured like municipal governments, with elections, budgets, and bureaucratic accountability. But many Haudenosaunee nations refused or created parallel systems. To this day, in communities such as Kanawha, Key, Mohawk, Onondaga, and Six Nations of the Grand River, there are both elected councils and traditional councils, sometimes in cooperation, sometimes in deep conflict. The traditional councils still select leaders by clan, still use consensus, and still cite the Great Law. They do not always seek recognition from settler states because they have their own continuity of legitimacy. This situation raises a critical question for political theory. Can a government be real if it is not recognized by outside powers, but still obeyed and honored by its people? The Haudenosaunee say yes. Influence on the U.S. Constitution, a contested legacy. One of the most debated topics in American political history is the degree to which the Haudenosaunee Confederacy influenced the U.S. Constitution. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and other founders were aware of Haudenosaunee governance. Franklin published accounts of council deliberations, admired their unity, and corresponded with leaders. The Albany Plan of Union, 1754, which Franklin proposed to unite the colonies, echoed Confederacy logic. In 1988, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution acknowledging the influence of the Iroquois Confederacy on the development of the United States Constitution. However, scholars debate the depth of this influence. Some argue that the framers merely admired the idea of unity among sovereign entities. Others say the principles of balance, federalism, and consensus had deeper echoes. Still others caution against romanticizing the connection without historical rigor. Regardless of where one lands, it is clear that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was a rare and functioning example of internation governance on the continent before 1776, and one that lasted far longer. Contemporary sovereignty and international presence. In the 21st century, Haudenosaunee nations have asserted sovereignty in new ways. The Iroquois Nationals lacrosse team, representing the Haudenosaunee, not Canada, or the U.S., competes in international events, using Haudenosaunee passports. Traditional councils engage in diplomatic statements on climate, land, and indigenous rights. Language revitalization programs are reawakening Mohawk, Oneida, and Onondaga speech essential to the operation of the Great Law. Youth are learning wampum interpretation, ceremonial protocol, and land-based governance alongside modern education. Though land has been lost and borders imposed, the political identity remains intact. There is no king, no single ruler, no empire. But there is a council still meeting, the Longhouse still standing. In the end, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's greatest power was not its military, nor its ability to negotiate trade or navigate colonial diplomacy. It was the internal logic of its system. Power comes from responsibility, not domination. Decisions require unanimity, not coercion. Leaders serve at the will of the people, not divine right. The past, present, and future must be considered together. In a world increasingly fractured, this system continues to offer an alternative model of what political life can be. Not louder, not faster, just more deliberate, more rooted. And so we ask, what is a nation if not the quiet persistence of shared agreements passed hand to hand, through memory, through fire, through time? Story 7. The Calusa Shell Kings see power in the pre-Columbian Southeast. When Spanish explorers arrived on the southwest coast of Florida in the early 1500s, they expected to find tribes of scattered agriculturalists, perhaps similar to those they had encountered elsewhere in the Southeast. Instead, they encountered something baffling, a coastal civilization that built its world not on fields, but on shells, not on corn, but on fish. Not with kings in palaces of gold, but with priests and rulers atop artificial islands of shell mounds, commanding respect, tribute, and territory without the usual hallmarks of civilization as the Europeans defined it. This was the realm of the Calusa. They ruled much of southern Florida from their capital at Mound Key, an island raised by human hands and discarded oyster shells. Their social hierarchy, religious system, and ability to extract tribute from neighbors made them one of the most powerful indigenous societies in the American Southeast. And yet they never farmed. This is the story of how environmental adaptation, ritual authority, and coastal mastery created an enduring power structure in a landscape often dismissed as marginal. A kingdom built on shells. The Calusa, pronounced Kah-Lusa, lived along the estuaries and mangrove flats of southwest Florida, from the 10,000 islands north to Charlotte Harbor. Rather than clearing forests for maize, they turned their environment-dense mangroves, shifting tides, and shallow bays into a system of abundance. They lived almost entirely by fishing, gathering, and shellfish harvesting. And with these resources, they built cities not in the usual sense, but in the form of shell mounds, ridges, and canals engineered over centuries. At the center of their civilization stood Mound Key, a 125-acre artificial island formed by millions of discarded oyster, clam, and mussel shells. Some of its mounds rose over 30 feet, supporting temples and elite residences. At its peak, it was home to thousands and served as the political and spiritual capital of the Calusa chiefdom. They didn't shape the land, they created it. Hierarchy without agriculture. Most civilizations that developed hierarchy, labor specialization, and centralized authority also practiced agriculture. Food surpluses supported priests, artisans, warriors, and rulers. The Calusa were different. By expertly managing coastal resources, they sustained a population dense enough to support elite classes without planting a single row of corn. They constructed massive fish traps and weirs, funneling tidal movements into enclosed areas where mullet, catfish, and sea trout were easily harvested. Mangrove root systems provided habitat for shellfish and crustaceans. Canoes allowed long-distance fishing and travel. This aquatic surplus allowed the Calusa to feed large populations and extract tribute from inland and coastal neighbors, sometimes in goods, sometimes in labor. Their rulers, known as caciques, presided over a stratified society, an elite ruling class with political and spiritual power, priests and ceremonial specialists, a commoner base responsible for food production and shell construction. subordinate coastal tribes required to pay tribute. This structure, largely misunderstood by early European chroniclers, was durable, complex, and uniquely adapted to its ecosystem. The role of ritual and myth. Spanish accounts, particularly those by Pedro Menéndez de Avilés and missionary observers, described a people deeply invested in ritual, symbolism, and cosmological hierarchy. At the top of the Calusa social order was not merely a king, but a sacred ruler believed to wield control over weather, tides, and the fertility of fish stocks. The Calusa viewed their rulers as intermediaries with the spiritual realm, necessary for balance between humans and the watery world they inhabited. One early Spanish visitor described the Calusa chief as served as if he were a god, carried by retainers, and never touched by commoners. His home, perched atop a mound, served as both residence and temple. Behind it, ceremonial plazas and shell courts hosted public events and elite rituals. Priests and ritual specialists conducted ceremonies to ensure the cycling of seasons, the return of fish, and the health of the community. Some evidence suggests belief in three souls, or spirits, within each person, one of which could linger in the village after death and cause illness if not properly honored. The Calusa religion was tightly intertwined with governance. To rule was to channel the unseen. Networks of power and tribute. The Calusa's influence extended far beyond their capital. They maintained a tributary network across southern Florida, receiving goods such as shark teeth used as tools and weapons, panther skins, inland plant products, labor for construction and ceremonies. Some of this tribute was likely redistributed through feasting, a common method in many indigenous societies to reinforce power, obligation, and social ties. Rather than conquest, the Calusa appear to have maintained dominance through ritual authority, economic control of coastal resources, and the symbolic weight of their capital center. Other chiefdoms in the southeast, such as the Mississippian cultures farther north, built vast cities of earth and maize. The Calusa built instead with shell and tide, network and belief. Early contact and the European response. When Spanish explorers reached Calusa territory in the early 1500s, they found an empire quite unlike the Aztec or Inca, but no less foreign. Initial contact was hostile. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon arrived in southwest Florida, hoping to find gold, trade, and territory. Instead, he was driven off by Calusa warriors and wounded by a poisoned arrow. He died soon after. The Calusa would repeat this resistance for decades. In 1566, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, founder of St. Augustine, attempted diplomacy. He made temporary peace with the Calusa chief Carlos and even arranged a marriage alliance with the chief's sister. A Spanish mission and fort were briefly established at Mound Key. But tensions remained high. Calusa elites were not interested in conversion or submission. The mission failed within a few years, the Spanish withdrew, and the Calusa continued to dominate the region for another century. To the Spanish, this was a kingdom they could not control, did not understand, and eventually gave up trying to govern. So we ask, how does a society maintain authority without farming, without cities, and without armies, only through the rhythm of tides, the weaving of nets, and the memory of shells? By the early 1600s, the Calusa remained a formidable power on the southwest coast of Florida. Their capital at Mound Key still rose above the estuarine waters, their shell mounds untouched by European settlement, and their ruling class firmly in control. While other indigenous societies were collapsing under pressure from European contact, disease, and colonization, the Calusa stood apart, unconquered, unconverted, and largely misunderstood. But isolation would not protect them forever. This section examines how the Calusa responded to expanding Spanish colonization, the role of their spiritual political system in resisting empire, and the complex dynamics that eventually led to the unraveling of their autonomy not through military defeat, but through slow attrition, epidemic disease, and the breakdown of regional networks. The empire of shells, it turns out, could not survive a world being reshaped by distant empires. Calusa diplomacy and the limits of alliance. In 1566, the Spanish, hoping to pacify the southern Florida coast and secure maritime routes between Havana and St. Augustine, attempted one of their most ambitious diplomatic missions in the region. They reached out to Chief Carlos, ruler of the Calusa. Carlos understood the Spanish were not simply traders or explorers. They were emissaries of a foreign empire, backed by muskets, ships, and priests. And yet he did not fear them. He welcomed Spanish Governor Pedro Menéndez de Avilés to Mound Key and agreed to a fragile peace. As part of the agreement, he offered his sister in marriage alliance, a common practice among elite indigenous societies, meant to forge ties of kinship and obligation. But Carlos had no intention of surrendering autonomy. He demanded Spanish protection against rival tribes and expressed disdain for Christianity. His people remained fiercely loyal to their traditional cosmology, their shell-built capital, and their tidal economy. The Spanish, meanwhile, misunderstood the nature of Calusa power. They believed that by converting Carlos and establishing a mission, they could control the region. Within a few years, the alliance collapsed. The mission was abandoned. The marriage alliance failed to secure peace. The Calusa expelled the Spaniards from their capital. They had survived first contact not by assimilation, but by calculated disengagement. A spiritual order challenged. To the Calusa, religious power and political authority were inseparable. The chief was not just a ruler, he was a spiritual intermediary, responsible for maintaining cosmic order. Spanish attempts to introduce Catholicism threatened not only the legitimacy of the ruling class, but the entire ideological foundation of Calusa governance. Missionaries struggled to convert the population. The Calusa rejected baptism, refused to destroy their idols, and resisted calls to abandon shell mounds and ceremonial practices. In their worldview, the cycles of tide, fish, and spirit were not mere superstition, they were the pillars of sovereignty. Even neighboring tribes who submitted to missionary pressure described the Calusa as fierce and untamable. And so, over the next century, the Spanish focused their efforts elsewhere, especially on more agricultural societies that were easier to fold into the colonial economy. But the Calusa still faced growing pressure from the slow-moving edge of empire. Disease, displacement, and decline. Despite avoiding occupation, the Calusa could not avoid the epidemiological consequences of contact. The spread of smallpox, measles, and other old-world diseases devastated indigenous populations across the Americas, often before direct contact even occurred. While we lack precise records for Calusa mortality rates, indirect evidence suggests that waves of disease weakened population density, undermined labor systems, and disrupted the ritual cycles critical to Calusa political structure. Meanwhile, intertribal dynamics shifted. Northern Muskogee-speaking tribes began pushing south, some displaced by European colonization. The Apalachee, Timucua, and other Florida tribes were being missionized or enslaved. Raiding networks, some armed with Spanish and English weapons, began targeting coastal communities. The Calusa could no longer rely on a stable network of tributary societies. Their influence shrank as former allies were absorbed, relocated, or destroyed. By the late 1600s, Calusa control of the Florida peninsula had become tenuous not because of any single battle lost, but because the world around them had shifted irreversibly. The rise of rival powers. In the early 1700s, the geopolitical map of southeastern North America grew more volatile. The Spanish were weakening. The British, centered in Carolina, were expanding through both trade and military proxies. Indigenous confederacies, such as the Creek, began asserting regional dominance. British-backed slaving raids, conducted by tribes like the Yamasee, began targeting Florida's native populations, including those previously under Calusa protection. Some Calusa villages were attacked, others were abandoned. The shell mounds that had once held ritual and political life were left silent, save for birds and waves. In 1704, the Appalachee missions to the north were destroyed by Creek and English forces, a warning of the fragility of indigenous autonomy in a colonial borderland. The Calusa, isolated and depopulated, were soon surrounded by more powerful and better-armed neighbors. The last records of Mound Key. By 1743, when Spanish missionaries once again attempted to re-establish contact with the Calusa, they found only a fragmented remnant. The Jesuit mission at Mound Key lasted less than 2 years. Missionaries reported that the population was small, scattered, and spiritually resistant. The descendants of Carlos still held some prestige, but the intricate political machinery of old had rusted in the salt air. Soon after, Mound Key was abandoned. The remaining Calusa people migrated south, seeking refuge among the Florida Keys, the southern tip of the peninsula, and eventually among the Cuban missions in Havana. Some were absorbed into the Tequesta or other coastal groups. Others disappeared from the historical record entirely. The final known Calusa survivors in Cuba were recorded in the early 1800s, living in isolated communities, far from the shell mounds their ancestors had raised from the sea. And so, a civilization without walls or gold or written history vanished not with a final battle, but with the retreat of tide, time, and memory. Today, Mound Key rises only a few dozen feet above the surrounding waters of Estero Bay, a quiet mangrove-rimmed island teeming with birds and mosquitoes. No palaces remain. No fish-filled canals shimmer in the sun. The ceremonial plazas are overgrown with subtropical scrub. To a casual visitor, it might appear as just another patch of high ground in the watery labyrinth of southwest Florida. But underfoot lies something extraordinary, a human-built landscape of memory, raised by hand, shell by shell, over centuries. Though the Calusa no longer exist as a distinct nation, their influence, ingenuity, and ecological legacy remain embedded in the coast they shaped. Archaeology, oral histories, and new ecological insights reveal a society that challenges old assumptions about civilization, power, and survival. This final section explores how the Calusa live on not just in ruins and records, but in how we understand the very idea of sustainability, power without agriculture, and the fragile boundary between land and sea. The landscape they built. Modern archaeological surveys have revealed that Calusa engineering was far more complex than early Spanish accounts suggested. At Mound Key, remote sensing, core sampling, and excavation have uncovered artificial canals cut straight through mangrove zones, designed to accommodate canoe traffic and tide-driven water flow. Shell causeways, connecting mounds and forming elevated walkways above the marsh. Fish traps, some stretching hundreds of feet, constructed from oyster shells and wood pilings designed to exploit tidal cycles for maximum yield. Stilt houses and platform dwellings built above water or on artificial ridges. In other parts of southwest Florida, at sites like Pineland, Yuzepa Island, and Hoars Island, similar mound complexes and canal systems have been found, suggesting a regional cultural template of shell construction and water-based living. This was not marginal subsistence. This was a maritime civilization. And it was built to last not centuries, but millennia. Ecology as infrastructure. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of the Calusa is their use of ecology as infrastructure. By understanding tides, fish migrations, and estuarine dynamics, the Calusa turned the shifting unpredictability of the Florida coast into a stable foundation for society. They did not try to control nature, they partnered with it. Fish traps didn't fight against the tide, they used its rhythms. Canals flowed with natural drainage patterns. Waste shells were not discarded but turned into land, raising mounds that resisted floods and symbolized permanence. Communities adapted to sea level changes, storm surges, and ecosystem shifts with remarkable resilience. This was not an industrialized economy, but it was sustainable in a way many modern systems are not. As sea levels rise today and urban planners study climate adaptation, Calusa strategies low-tech, decentralized, ecologically rooted offer surprising insight. They did not build levees. They built with the water, oral memory, and indigenous continuity. Though the Calusa as a distinct people faded from the historical record by the early 19th century, threads of their identity may have persisted quietly woven into other indigenous communities. Some scholars and indigenous oral historians believe that Calusa survivors merged with groups like the Tequesta, Miccosukee, or even early Seminole peoples in the Florida interior. Ceremonial objects and iconography associated with the Calusa appear in later sites across southern Florida. Place names in the region retain linguistic echoes of the Calusa tongue. The canoe culture and fish-based subsistence patterns of Gulf Coast indigenous groups bear striking resemblances to Calusa lifeways. While direct descent is difficult to trace due to cultural suppression, forced relocation, and assimilation, the Calusa are not entirely lost. They persist in memory, in shell mounds turned into sacred ground, and in the rights indigenous Floridians assert today over ancestral landscapes. Lessons for the present. The Calusa challenge many modern assumptions about what constitutes a complex society. They had no writing, yet maintained historical memory through ritual and structure. They never adopted agriculture, yet built urban-scale settlements. They operated a hierarchical society, but based on aquatic abundance, not landholding or metallurgy. They resisted both colonization and conversion longer than most other native groups in the Southeast. Most importantly, their civilization shows that sustainability and complexity are not opposites. They developed a society that was, for centuries, adaptive, resource-rich, and ecologically integrated. While empires across the world rose and fell by exhausting their environments, the Calusa lived within the carrying capacity of their watery world. Until they couldn't anymore, not because of internal failure, but because of global forces that shattered the ecological and political networks they depended on. Shell's testimony. Walk the shores of Southwest Florida today, and you'll still find the remnants of their world. Shell middens buried under parking lots. Canals now dry or filled with silt, their original purpose hidden. Place names like Caloosahatchee, River of the Calusa. Mound Key, now a state archaeological site, slowly eroding with every storm surge. Each discarded oyster shell tells a story of food, ritual, labor, and community. Each mound is a monument without inscription, yet full of meaning. The Calusa didn't leave palaces or pyramids. They left islands, built from the refuse of daily life transformed into sacred geography. The enduring question: what makes a civilization powerful? Is it its armies, its agriculture, its monuments, its alphabet? Or is it its ability to persist in place, to adapt to a specific ecology, and to root its social order not in expansion, but in balance? The Calusa defy easy categorization. They ruled by ritual, fished with the tides, and built with shells. And though the world eventually pushed past them, their wisdom remains beneath the water and sand, waiting to be remembered. And so we ask, In a time of climate instability and ecological crisis, what might we still learn from a kingdom that rose without plows, ruled without iron, and vanished without a war? Story 8. The Powhatan Paramountcy Confederation at the Edge of Empire. When English colonists arrived in what they would name Virginia in 1607, they imagined themselves as pioneers of a new world. But they had actually stepped into the heart of an already organized political structure, ruled by a powerful and calculating man named Seneca, better known to history by the name the English gave him, Powhatan. He was not a king in the European sense, nor was he a tribal chief among equals. He was the architect of a fragile but formidable paramount chiefdom, a loose network of 30 or more Algonquian-speaking groups bound together by tribute, marriage, ceremony, and diplomacy. Before the Jamestown colony ever set up its wooden palisades, Seneca had spent decades expanding his influence across the tidewater region of the Chesapeake Bay. He had risen not through brute conquest, but by offering security, material redistribution, and the language of spiritual legitimacy. This was a landscape of forests and estuaries, canoes and cornfields, kinship and exchange. And it was already under control. The land and the people. The area around the Chesapeake Bay was rich in resources, rivers teeming with fish, forests full of deer, fertile land for corn, beans, and squash. For thousands of years, native peoples thrived here in semi-permanent agricultural villages, supplemented by seasonal hunting and fishing. By the 1500s, many of these groups spoke related dialects of Eastern Algonquian and lived in relatively autonomous towns or bands. These included names the English would later record: Pamunkey, Mattapony, Chickahominy, Nansemond, and Powhatan, among others. Each group was led by a Werowansk male leader, or Werowanskwa female leader, who presided over local decisions and resource distribution. The towns were often surrounded by palisades, and leadership was usually inherited through matrilineal lines. There was no overarching ruler. That changed with Seneca. Who was Seneca? Seneca was born sometime in the mid-1500s, likely into the leadership of the Powhatan group near the fall line of the James River, the area of present-day Richmond, Virginia. Through a mix of alliance building, strategic marriages, and occasional violence, he began expanding his influence over neighboring Werowansks. He didn't destroy these groups, he absorbed them. Those who joined his system gained protection from external enemies, access to redistributed tribute and trade goods, participation in ceremonial life that reinforced shared identity, a chance to retain some autonomy as long as tribute flowed. Over time, Seneca came to be seen not simply as a powerful man, but as the Mamanatoic, a sacred leader whose authority was cosmic as well as political. By the time the English arrived, he presided over a paramountcy that stretched from the James River to the Potomac, covering an area home to perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 people. This was no scattered collection of villages. This was a confederation, fluid, decentralized but real. How the confederation worked. The Powhatan paramountcy was not a monarchy, nor was it an empire in the European sense. It was a network of obligations. Each member group retained its local leader, but owed the Mamanatoic tribute in the form of corn, copper, deerskins, and shell beads, known as wampum or roanoke. In return, they received security, feasting, and the material signs of shared identity, particularly the ritual use of copper, which was associated with power and the spiritual world. Seneca reinforced loyalty in several ways. He sent his sons or close ally to govern newly absorbed towns. He arranged marriages between his family and local leaders. He acted as a spiritual leader, with priests and temples that centralized ceremonial life. He controlled the redistribution of high-status items, reinforcing his status as the center of exchange. But it was also fragile. Some groups joined willingly, others reluctantly, and a few, like the Chickahominy, maintained partial independence, trading and intermarrying without full submission. Wahenseneca ruled more by diplomatic weight than by military imposition, and that diplomacy would soon be tested. Spiritual power and political control. The Mamanachewik was not just a secular leader. Powhatan's spirituality involved a belief in Manitou's spiritual power present in people, places, and objects. Certain individuals, especially leaders and priests, were thought to have access to this power. Wahenseneca carefully cultivated this image. He was said to communicate with spiritual forces, consult with priests, and make decisions in accordance with omens, dreams, and divine signs. At Uttamussac, a sacred site near present-day King William County, priests kept sacred items, conducted rituals, and maintained the symbolic order of the chiefdom. This priesthood reinforced the Mamanachewik's legitimacy and provided continuity across diverse member groups. Ruling through spiritual authority allowed Wahenseneca to do something rare: create cohesion without direct control. And cohesion was exactly what the Confederation needed as new forces arrived by sea. The English arrive. In 1607, 3 English ships carrying 104 colonists arrived at the mouth of the James River. They called their settlement Jamestown, after King James I. To the English, the land was theirs to claim. To Wahenseneca, they were simply another foreign group to manage, perhaps like the Siouan-speaking Monacans in the uplands, or the rival Susquehannocks to the north. At first, he took a measured approach. He allowed some contact. He tested their intentions. He ordered raids and offers of food, alternating as needed. It's possible he saw the English as potential allies or vassals, who could be incorporated into his existing political system. Some historians speculate that his decision to spare Captain John Smith in late 1607 may have been a ritual of adoption rather than mercy. To Wahenseneca, diplomacy was not weakness, it was strategy. But to the English, it was something else entirely: food, tribute, and friction. Within months, Jamestown began to collapse. Disease, starvation, and conflict with neighboring groups left the colonists increasingly dependent on native food and goodwill. Wahenseneca allowed his daughter Madoka, better known as Pocahontas, to serve as an intermediary. But this wasn't a gesture of friendship in the European sense. It was part of a calculated political performance. Food gifts were tools of power, not charity. Allowing the English to survive, winter reinforced their dependency. Refusing food when tribute was not offered reminded them who controlled the land. But the English misunderstood this system. They did not see themselves as vassals or subordinates. They saw themselves as settlers in a land they believed was empty, hostile, and theirs by right. Tensions escalated. Raids turned into battles. Exchanges became coercions. And by 1609, the two systems, one based on networked obligation, the other on private property and conquest, were on a collision course. So we ask, what happens when a system built on kinship, ritual, and consensus confronts one built on permanence, walls, and sovereignty? By 1609, Wahenseneca's careful balancing act was unraveling. The English at Jamestown were no longer a temporary annoyance. They were building permanent structures, demanding land, and cutting down forests. Their survival increasingly depended on coercing food from native towns. They viewed tribute not as diplomacy but as their due, backed by force. The Mamanachewik, who had once tried to integrate the foreigners into his sphere of influence, now saw a different picture. The English were not subjects, not guests, and not allies. They were an expansionist threat. And so Wahenseneca chose resistance. What followed was a long and shifting struggle. known in colonial records as the First Anglo-Powhatan War, 1609–1614. But to the Powhatan, it was something more elemental, a defense of land, balance, and a way of life. It was also the beginning of a slow fracturing not just of territory, but of the internal cohesion that had made the Powhatan Confederacy strong. The starving time and the edge of collapse. In the winter of 1609–1610, Powhatan's strategy was to encircle and isolate Jamestown. Native towns cut off trade. Ambushes were carried out along river routes. The Confederation's member groups were ordered to refuse food or aid to the colonists. Skirmishes increased, making it dangerous for the English to leave their palisade. The result for the English was catastrophic. By the spring, only 60 of the original 500 settlers remained alive. They had eaten shoe leather, dogs, and even resorted to cannibalism. Powhatan's embargo had nearly succeeded in starving the colony out. But in May 1610, just as Jamestown was being abandoned, new ships arrived. The third supply mission, led by Lord de la Warr, brought fresh men, weapons, and a much more militarized mindset. The English now adopted a total war strategy. They raided native towns, destroyed stored food, and burned crops. Rather than coexist or negotiate, they aimed to break the Confederation's will to resist. Seneca, nearing 60, withdrew to his stronghold at Oripax, deep in the Chickahominy swamp. The conflict was no longer a contest of diplomacy. It was a war of attrition. The role of Pocahontas. In the English imagination, Pocahontas is often cast as a peacemaker, a young woman who bridged two worlds, saved John Smith, and married an Englishman out of love. But the reality was far more complex. By 1613, she had been captured by English forces during a raid on a Paspahegh town. Held hostage in Jamestown, she was baptized as Rebecca and pressured into adopting English customs. During her captivity, she met John Rolfe, a tobacco planter, and eventually married him in 1614. This marriage was deeply political. For the English, it symbolized peace through assimilation. For some Powhatan leaders, it offered a temporary reprieve from war. For Seneca, it may have been an unbearable blow to his authority. He did not attend the wedding. The union produced a brief diplomatic thaw, known as the Peace of Pocahontas, and allowed the English to expand their settlements along the James River. But underneath, the balance of power was shifting. The English were growing in number. The Powhatan Confederacy was fraying. Death of a paramount chief. In 1618, Seneca died. The exact circumstances of his death remain unclear, but colonial records suggest it was natural causes. He was likely buried in a traditional tomb house, surrounded by spiritual offerings, possibly on an island in the Pamunkey River. His death marked a turning point. Leadership passed to his brother, Appichapam, and then to another brother, Opchincanuf, a much more aggressive figure, determined to resist English expansion by force. Opchincanuf had likely been involved in earlier military strategy and was a true believer in the spiritual and political mission of the Confederacy. Under his leadership, the Powhatan world would strike back, but not from a position of strength. Rather, it was a desperate assertion of sovereignty, as the Confederation's territory shrank and its member groups lost cohesion. The structure Seneca had built was now under existential pressure. The 1622 Uprising. On March 22, 1622, Opchincanuf launched a coordinated assault on English settlements. More than 300 colonists were killed, nearly one-third of the English population. Towns were burned, and outlying farms were destroyed. It was one of the most effective indigenous offensives in early colonial history. But the English retaliated with brutal intensity. They destroyed native villages, poisoned food supplies during false peace talks, and pushed surviving tribes deeper into the interior. Over the next decade, the English solidified control over much of the James River corridor. The Powhatan Confederacy did not collapse immediately, but it fractured. Some member groups sued for peace independently. Others were targeted for destruction. The English began establishing tributary tribes, who paid symbolic obedience in exchange for survival. The unity that Wahunsenacawh had so carefully assembled was gone. His model of diplomacy, spiritual authority, and kinship had no place in the rigid colonial world being built. What the Confederation left behind. By the mid-1600s, the Powhatan Confederacy was no longer a political power. But it had accomplished something remarkable. It had united over 30 autonomous groups into a functioning alliance. It had resisted colonization for over a decade. It had preserved a cultural memory that lives on among tribes like the Pamunkey, Mattapony, and others still recognized in Virginia today. Wahunsenacawh's structure of leadership, loose, relational, spiritually embedded, could not survive in the face of settler colonialism, but it remains a testament to the complexity and adaptability of indigenous governance systems. It was not a monarchy, not a council of equals, not an empire. It was something else. So we ask, what happens to a political vision when the world around it refuses to recognize its legitimacy and replaces dialogue with conquest? By the mid-17th century, the once powerful Powhatan Confederacy was no longer a political force capable of resisting English colonization. But that didn't mean it vanished. What followed was a long, quiet endurance of identity without territory, of culture without a capital, and of sovereignty in fragments. Wahunsenacawh's vision of a unified tidewater world faded as his successors fought and faltered. But elements of the paramountcy, the social memory, the tribal names, the relationships among peoples persisted in hidden ways. This final section explores what happened after the fall, how native groups adapted, survived, and negotiated their place in a colony that was rapidly becoming a plantation society. It's also a story about how power isn't always about control, and how the faint traces of a confederation can ripple into modern times. The treaty tribes and survival through accommodation. After decades of warfare, culminating in renewed conflict in 1644-1646, English colonial authorities recognized that not all native peoples were enemies. Some still held territory, albeit greatly reduced. Others had made peace to avoid annihilation. In 1646, a formal treaty ended the Second Anglo-Powhatan War. It dissolved the Confederacy's political authority, named specific tribes as tributary to the English crown, established boundaries and land grants, often small and heavily monitored, required annual tribute payments of goods like fish or game to the colonial governor. These treaty tribes included the Pamunkey, Mattapony, Nansemond, and others descendants of groups once bound to Wahunsenacawh's paramountcy. The term tribute here masked the reality. It was symbolic submission in exchange for survival. These communities retained some autonomy. They elected their leaders, kept certain ceremonies, and lived on recognized reservation land, the earliest reservation system in what would become the United States. But they were under pressure. Land loss continued. English courts increasingly intervened in internal tribal matters. Native identity was subject to scrutiny, particularly under racial classification systems that later emerged. Still, they endured. Cultural persistence and the matrilineal thread. Even as political independence faded, cultural continuity remained strong. Powhatan societies had always passed status, identity, and property through the mother's line. This matrilineal system allowed for the survival of lineage and tradition, even as men were killed in wars or forced into labor systems. Women in these communities preserved oral histories, maintained language fragments and kinship ties, held land rights and domestic authority within the community, passed on ceremonial practices, including tobacco rituals, river offerings, and naming traditions. The English rarely understood the depth of these systems. Their legal framework assumed patrilineal inheritance, leading to frequent conflicts over land ownership and identity. In this gap of understanding, native culture survived not in the halls of power, but in the rhythms of home, riverbank, and memory. What the English forgot, the land remembered. Even as settlers cleared forests and renamed rivers, place names persisted. The Mattapony River still flows into the York. The Pamunkey people still live on lands granted in the 1600s. The Rappahannock and Appomattox tribes retain their ancestral names. The Cheronhaka, Nottoway, and Nansemond still trace their presence to pre-colonial times. These names are not remnants, they are residues of sovereignty. They remind us that the Powhatan Confederacy was not simply a historical footnote. It was a vibrant society whose organizational model distributed authority, spiritual governance, relational diplomacy was never fully extinguished. Archaeological research in the Tidewater region continues to uncover remnants of palisaded towns, burial sites, and longhouse foundations, and many modern-day descendants of the Powhatan tribes maintain continuity with that deep past. Recognition, erasure, and the struggle for identity. For centuries, Powhatan descendant communities lived in a strange in-between space. Legally recognized under colonial and state systems, yet excluded from many rites. Visible in tribute ceremonies and historical commemorations, yet marginalized in public memory. Survivors of colonization, yet often denied full recognition of their status. In Virginia, strict racial classification laws in the 20th century, including the infamous Racial Integrity Act of 1924, sought to erase Native identity by forcing individuals to choose between white or colored. This had devastating effects on tribal records, political organization, and land rights. Despite this, 7 tribes descended from the Powhatan Confederacy, including the Pamunkey and Mattapony, were granted federal recognition in the 21st century. Recognition wasn't about restoring lost lands or reviving ancient power structures. It was about acknowledging that they had never disappeared. Reflections on the paramountcy. What made Wahin Senecaw's vision so remarkable was its ambition and subtlety. He didn't dream of empire in the European mold. He sought unity without uniformity, rooted in shared ceremonies, political flexibility, and respect for difference. He ruled not by decree, but by consensus, redistribution, and spiritual significance. His confederacy wasn't militarily dominant, but it was adaptive and resilient. And even as the English dismantled it piece by piece, the underlying social networks of kinship, language, and river-based life proved harder to erase. In the end, what he built was not permanent, but it was remembered. The Long Shadow. Each November, tribal representatives still bring deer, fish, and game to the governor's mansion in Richmond, in a symbolic tribute ceremony dating back to the 1600s treaties. They wear traditional clothing. They speak the names of their ancestors. They walk through the heart of a city built on land they once ruled. This is not mere reenactment. It is historical continuity, a gesture of dignity in the face of centuries of marginalization. And somewhere in that ceremony, in the sound of a drum or the language of a blessing, one can still sense the echoes of Wahin Senecaw's vision, a world where many could live together, under the rhythms of season, spirit, and soil. So we ask, If a confederation can outlive its central leader, its capital, and even its independence, did it ever truly fall? Or does sovereignty sometimes endure in memory, in ritual, and in the names we still speak?